there is a ruined pyramid at Saqqara that most tourists walk past without stopping. It is not one of the famous ones. It is not the Step Pyramid of Djoser, the revolutionary construction that launched the pyramid-building tradition and still dominates the Saqqara Plateau after 4,700 years. It is not the graceful, smooth-sided pyramid that later generations built at Meidum. It is not the angular wonder at Giza that has been one of the most recognized shapes in human history for the past 4,500 years. It is a ruined pyramid, reduced by time and ancient quarrying to a low mound of rubble, standing at the northeastern corner of Djoser's great enclosure, as if acknowledging the priority of the older structure beside it. But inside the ruin, if you know where to look, there is a burial chamber still intact, and in the vicinity of the ruin, buried beneath centuries of sand that excavators have been methodically removing since the 1950s CE, there is the remnant of a mortuary temple that once contained one of the most remarkable sculptural programs in the history of Egyptian art. Fragments of painted relief carvings, whose quality, precision, and sheer ambition were not matched by anything produced in Egypt for at least a century before them, and that set the standard for royal sculpture for the entire subsequent Old Kingdom. The pyramid belonged to Userkaf. He was the first king of the Fifth Dynasty of Egypt, ruling approximately 4,400 years ago, in the period immediately following the great pyramid builders of the Fourth Dynasty. The dynasty of Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure, who built the three great pyramids at Giza. He came to the throne at a moment of extraordinary transition in the history of the Egyptian state, a moment when the specific character of the pharaonic ideology was being fundamentally reorganized around a new theological center, when the relationship between the king and the sun god Ra was being transformed in ways that would reshape the institutional and the artistic and the architectural ambitions of the Egyptian state for the next century and a half. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Userkaf was, but why the specific transition that his reign initiated. The shift from the pyramid-centered royal theology of the Fourth Dynasty to the Sun Temple-centered theology of the Fifth was one of the most consequential developments in the entire history of the Egyptian civilization, and why it produced, as its most immediately visible legacy, some of the most beautiful royal sculpture that Egypt ever made. Let that sink in. The founder of the Fifth Dynasty is almost invisible in the popular telling of Egyptian history. The Fourth Dynasty gets the famous pyramids. The Sixth Dynasty gets the pyramid texts, those extraordinary inscriptions that are among the oldest surviving religious literature in the world. The Fifth Dynasty, sandwiched between them, is the dynasty that introduced the sun cult, built the sun temples, and produced the finest royal relief sculpture of the entire Old Kingdom. And its founder, Userkaf, has been standing in the shadow of the Giza pyramids for 4,000 years, largely unknown. The shadow ends here. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The world of the Fifth Dynasty is the world of the Egyptian Old Kingdom at its administrative and cultural peak. The great experiment of pyramid building had been underway for approximately 200 years when Userkaf came to the throne. The state had accumulated, across those 2 centuries, the specific organizational capacity and the specific institutional depth that sustained the Old Kingdom at its greatest extent. The administrative apparatus of the nome system, the geographic division of Egypt into administrative districts, each managed by its own official hierarchy, was fully functioning. The scribal tradition that produced the sophisticated literary and documentary culture of the later periods was developing rapidly. The artistic traditions, the relief carving, the sculpture in the round, the specific conventions of the pharaonic representational tradition had reached the specific level of technical mastery that the Fifth Dynasty's finest work would express. Into this world, Userkaf came. He came, if the ancient tradition is to be believed, from a specific religious origin, from a family whose connection to the sun god Ra at Heliopolis, the ancient sacred city of the solar cult north of Memphis, gave his dynasty its specific character and its specific theological agenda. Whether the specific tradition about his origins preserved in the Userkaf papyrus, the extraordinary literary text that recounts a prophecy about the birth of the first three Fifth Dynasty kings as the sons of Ra himself, reflects historical reality or mythological elaboration, is a question that this account will examine. What is not in question is that Userkaf inaugurated a transformation of the royal ideology that had consequences reaching across the entire subsequent history of the Egyptian state. The transformation was from a pyramid-focused to a sun temple-focused royal theology. The pyramid was not abandoned. Userkaf built his own pyramid at Saqqara, modest in comparison to the Fourth Dynasty giants, but genuine. But alongside the pyramid, in a specific architectural innovation that his Fifth Dynasty successors would develop and elaborate, he built the first of the solar temples, the specific new architectural form that expressed, in monumental building, the new theological relationship between the king and the sun god Ra that defined the Fifth Dynasty's particular contribution to the Egyptian civilizational tradition. That contribution and the specific man who initiated it is the subject of this account. To understand Userkaf, you need to understand the world he inherited, and the world he inherited was one of the most extraordinary civilizational environments that had ever existed, produced by 2 centuries of pyramid-building ambition and the specific institutional development that sustained it. The Fourth Dynasty of Egypt, the dynasty of Sneferu and Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure, and the other rulers of the Great Pyramid-building period, had transformed the Egyptian state in ways that are genuinely difficult to convey in their full scale. The construction of the Giza pyramids alone, a project that lasted across most of the Fourth Dynasty, consuming the organizational resources of the most efficient agricultural economy in the ancient world for generations, had required the development of an administrative and logistical apparatus of unprecedented sophistication. The quarrying operations that extracted millions of tons of limestone from the Tura deposits south of Cairo, the transport systems that moved those millions of tons to the construction sites, the management of the labor force, not slaves, as the popular imagination has long assumed, but skilled workers and their supervisors, fed and housed and medically cared for in a systematic way that the archaeological evidence of the workers' village at Giza has revealed. The architectural and engineering intelligence that designed and executed the specific construction sequences that produced the pyramid's extraordinary precision. All of this required and produced a state of extraordinary organizational capacity. The Fourth Dynasty pyramid building program was not simply a construction project. It was the specific mechanism through which the Egyptian state developed the administrative depth that the subsequent Old Kingdom would deploy for its other achievements. The pyramid was the engine of institutional development, and the institutional development it produced was the foundation on which the Fifth Dynasty and its successors built. But the Fourth Dynasty's extraordinary pyramid-building program also produced, or at least accelerated, a specific structural tension that the Fifth Dynasty was called to resolve. The tension was between the pharaonic ideology, as it had developed across the Fourth Dynasty, in which the king was himself divine, himself a god, himself in some sense the primary object of the religious system, rather than simply a mediator between the human world and the divine, and the older and deeper religious tradition of the Egyptian priesthood centered on the sun god Ra at Heliopolis, which understood the cosmic order not as the expression of the king's personal divinity, but as the expression of Ra's eternal solar governance. The Fourth Dynasty kings had, in their most ambitious building, expressed the ideology of personal royal divinity in its most extreme form. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is, among other things, a statement about the specific nature of the pharaoh's divinity, the king as the sun itself, the pyramid as the petrified solar ray, the entire complex as the mechanism for the dead king's eternal solar journey. The scale of the statement was unprecedented. It was also, in its specific demands on the resources of the Egyptian state, a statement that the institutional sustainability of the pyramid building program was difficult to maintain indefinitely. The Fifth Dynasty's reorganization of the royal theology around the sun cult, the specific reorientation that Userkaf initiated, was, in this context, not simply a religious change. It was a political and institutional adjustment, a recalibration of the relationship between the pharaonic authority and the priestly establishment at Heliopolis, and a specific architectural response to the question of what form royal building should take in the aftermath of the Fourth Dynasty's extraordinary but organizationally demanding pyramid program. The discovery moment for the modern scholarly understanding of the Fifth Dynasty. The specific moment when the archaeology of the period began to yield the evidence that allowed its specific contribution to be assessed, came across a series of excavations beginning in the mid-19th century of the modern era and continuing through the 20th. The German Orientalist Karl Richard Lepsius, leading a systematic survey of Egyptian monuments in the 1840s CE, was among the first modern scholars to document the pyramid sites of the Fifth Dynasty rulers in sufficient detail to establish their general character. His survey produced the first modern map of the Abu Sir pyramid field, the site south of Giza, where several Fifth Dynasty rulers built their pyramids, and identified the general locations of the sun temples that the dynasty was known from ancient sources to have constructed. But the most important modern excavation of Fifth Dynasty material was the work of the Czech Egyptological Institute, which has been conducting systematic excavations at the Abusir site since the 1960s of the modern era under the direction of Miroslav Werner and his colleagues. Werner's work at Abusir, patient, systematic, extraordinarily productive over decades of sustained excavation, has produced the most comprehensive modern picture of the Fifth Dynasty available to scholarship. His monumental synthesis of the Abusir evidence, combined with the analysis of the papyrus archive found there, the Abusir papyri, discussed in detail in the exploration chapters of this account, gave the Fifth Dynasty an archaeological visibility that it had not previously possessed. The Abusir papyri deserve special mention at the outset of this section, because they are one of the most important documentary discoveries in the history of Egyptian archaeology. Found in the tomb of a Fifth Dynasty court official in the late 19th century, they are the oldest administrative papyri in the history of ancient Egypt, the earliest surviving documents of the Egyptian bureaucracy, providing the first detailed picture available of how the Egyptian state actually organized itself at the administrative level, rather than simply what it built and what it inscribed. The papyri record the administrative routine of the mortuary temple of the Fifth Dynasty pharaoh Neferekare, the roster of priests, the schedule of offerings, the inventory of temple equipment, the records of administrative decisions. They are, in essence, the day-to-day records of a specific Old Kingdom institution, preserved by the specific accident of their deposition in an archaeological context that protected them from the decomposition that destroyed most ancient papyri. Reading these documents, which require specialist knowledge of the early hieratic script in which they are written, gives a picture of the Fifth Dynasty administrative world that no other category of evidence provides. A picture not of monuments and inscriptions, but of actual administrative routines, of specific people performing specific tasks at specific times, of the institutional reality of daily life in the Old Kingdom state. That institutional reality is the background against which Userkaf's specific contributions must be understood. He was not building in a vacuum. He was building within a specific institutional world, the world of the Old Kingdom state at its peak, and his specific contributions were shaped by and in turn shaped that world. The sun cult he inaugurated was not simply a royal preference for a particular deity. It was an institutional reorganization of the relationship between the royal authority and the priestly establishment, a reorganization whose consequences for the institutional development of the Egyptian state reached well beyond his own reign, shaping the specific character of the Fifth Dynasty's cultural and artistic achievements, and establishing the theological framework within which the pyramid texts of the Sixth Dynasty would eventually be composed. The scale of this contribution is not visible in the physical remains of Userkaf's pyramid, which is modest by the standards of the dynasty he was founding in the shadow of. It is visible in the architectural innovation of the Solar Temple, the new building type that his reign introduced. and in the specific transformation of the royal ideology that the solar temple expressed. It is visible in the extraordinary sculptural program of his mortuary temple, whose quality set the standard for the entire subsequent Fifth Dynasty, and it is visible in the long trajectory of the sun cult's influence on Egyptian civilization, an influence that would eventually produce not only the Fifth Dynasty's sun temples, but the great temples of Ra at Karnak, the solar theology of the New Kingdom, and ultimately the specific cosmological framework within which the ancient Egyptians understood their place in the universe for the next 2,000 years. Userkaf is the beginning of this arc. Understanding what he set in motion requires the specific examination of the specific evidence: the pyramid, the temple, the sculptural program, the ancient textual tradition that the following sections provide: the specific question of how the Fifth Dynasty came to the throne, the specific mechanism by which Userkaf replaced the Fourth Dynasty's ruling family, is one of the most discussed and intriguing questions in the study of the Old Kingdom, because the ancient evidence offers a specific story whose relationship to historical reality is genuinely uncertain. The Westcar Papyrus, a literary text preserved on a papyrus in the Berlin Museum that appears to have been composed in the Middle Kingdom, but that relates stories set in the Old Kingdom, contains a remarkable account of the origin of the first three Fifth Dynasty kings. In the story, the magician Jedi tells the Fourth Dynasty king Khufu that the wife of a priest of Ra at Heliopolis will bear 3 sons who will become kings of Egypt. The sons are described as the literal sons of Ra, conceived by the sun god himself, with a mortal woman, the wife of a priest at the sacred solar city. This origin story is not historical in any literal sense. Egyptian kings were regularly described as the sons of Ra. The title Son of Ra was one of the standard components of the royal titulary, and the specific narrative of the Fifth Dynasty founders as the literal sons of Ra is mythological elaboration rather than biographical record, but it encodes something real about the specific character of the Fifth Dynasty's founding claim. The claim of a particularly intense and particular direct connection to the solar deity that distinguished the Fifth Dynasty's theological orientation from the Fourth Dynasty's more pyramid-centered royal ideology. Whether the actual historical transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Dynasty involved a change of ruling family, whether Userkaf was not of the Fourth Dynasty's bloodline and came to power through a break in the dynastic succession, or whether the transition was smooth within the same extended royal family, is a matter of scholarly debate. The available evidence does not fully resolve the question, but the specific theological orientation of the Fifth Dynasty, expressed most directly in the solar temple program that Userkaf initiated, is clearly a genuine development rather than simply a continuation of the Fourth Dynasty's approach. The specific location of Userkaf's pyramid at Saqqara, rather than at Abusir or Giza, where most Fourth Dynasty pyramids were built, is itself a statement about the specific character of his reign's theological agenda. By placing his pyramid at Saqqara in the immediate vicinity of Djoser's step pyramid, the monument that had founded the pyramid building tradition, Userkaf was connecting his own building program to the earliest and most theologically foundational expression of the tradition. He was reaching back to the beginning, not simply building another Fourth Dynasty pyramid at Giza, but locating himself at the original sacred site of the pyramid tradition, next to the structure that had defined what a pyramid was and what it meant. This was a deliberate choice. The geography of pyramid building in the Old Kingdom was not accidental. The specific locations of specific rulers' pyramids reflected specific ideological and political choices about which tradition to connect to, which sacred geography to claim, which aspect of the complex royal ideology to emphasize. Userkaf's choice of Saqqara was a statement about his relationship to the founding tradition of the pharaonic building program, and it needs to be read alongside his solar temple program as the two architectural expressions of a specific theological agenda. The Heliopolis connection, the specific relationship between the Fifth Dynasty's theological orientation and the ancient solar cult of the city known in the Hebrew Bible as On, the city where Joseph would eventually have his famous encounter with the daughter of the priest of Ra. was not invented by Userkaf. The sun god Ra had been a major element of the Egyptian theological tradition since at least the early Old Kingdom, and the specific role of the sun in the pharaonic ideology, the king as the son of Ra, the king's royal journey as a solar journey, was present in embryonic form from the earliest phases of the tradition. What the Fifth Dynasty did was shift the institutional and architectural emphasis so that the solar theology became the organizing center of the royal religious program, rather than simply one element among several. The specific mechanism of this shift was the solar temple, the new building type that Userkaf introduced, and that 6 of the 9 Fifth Dynasty rulers would build, each with their own temple at a site north of Abusir on a desert promontory overlooking the Nile Valley. The solar temple was not a conventional temple of the kind that Egyptian religious architecture had previously developed. It was a specific architectural form designed to express the specific theological understanding of the solar deity's relationship to the king, a large courtyard containing a massive squat obelisk, not the slender high obelisk of later periods, but a short, massive, almost pyramidal form called a benben, and a sacrificial altar open to the sky, within which the rituals of solar worship were performed in the full light of the god, whose presence was the light itself. The specific iconographic significance of the benben stone, the original sacred stone at Heliopolis, on which the sun god Ra had first alighted at the creation of the world, the physical locus of the solar deity's first terrestrial manifestation, was the theological heart of the solar temple. The massive stone version of the benben that Userkaf built at his solar temple was the monumental expression of the specific belief that the place where the rituals were performed was, in a theological sense, the place of the solar deity's original earthly presence. This specific theology, the belief in the sacred presence of the divine in specific physical places and specific physical objects, is one of the most fundamental features of the Egyptian religious tradition, and it operated in the solar temple program with the same logic that it operated in the pyramid program. The pyramid was the specific physical form through which the dead king's divine energy was expressed, and through which his solar journey was ritually enacted. The solar temple was the specific physical form through which the living king's solar theology was expressed, and through which his connection to Ra was ritually maintained. The shift from pyramid to solar temple as the primary architectural expression of the royal theology was therefore not a rejection of the pyramid ideology, but a development of it, a specific elaboration of the solar dimension of the existing theological framework that had always been present in the pharaonic tradition. Userkaf did not abandon the pyramid, he built one, but by building the solar temple alongside it, he reorganized the architectural hierarchy within which the pyramid sat, elevating the solar dimension of the royal theology to a new level of institutional and architectural prominence. The scale of this architectural and theological reorganization, and the specific quality of the sculptural program that accompanied it at Userkaf's mortuary temple, are the two most important elements of his specific contribution to the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Both deserve the detailed examination that the following sections provide: the solar temple and the pyramid together, the new theology and the inherited tradition together, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, standing at the beginning of the arc that would lead to the sun temples of Abusir and the pyramid texts of the Sixth Dynasty and the solar theology of the New Kingdom. That arc begins with Userkaf, and understanding the beginning requires understanding both the world he inherited and the specific innovations he introduced into it. The foundation is now established. The scale is clear. The specific examination begins in the following section. The specific question of where Userkaf built his solar temple and why he chose that location connects his architectural program to a specific geography of sacred significance that the subsequent Fifth Dynasty would develop into one of the most consistent and most coherent architectural traditions of the Old Kingdom period. The site of Abu Ghurab, north of Abusir on the desert edge overlooking the Nile Valley, is where Userkaf's solar temple was located, and where the best preserved of the Fifth Dynasty solar temples, the Sun Temple of Nuusere, still preserves enough structural evidence for the specific architectural form of these extraordinary buildings to be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. The choice of this specific location, elevated, commanding, facing east toward the rising sun, was not accidental. The solar theology required a specific geography, a place where the rising sun could be seen in its full unobstructed glory, where the rituals performed in the open courtyard were literally suffused with the solar light whose theological significance they expressed. The elevation above the valley floor, the eastern orientation, the open sky, these were the architectural requirements of a theology that insisted on the unmediated presence of the divine in the physical form of the sun's light. Egyptian temple architecture was typically organized around the principle of progressive obscurity. The outer courts open to the public, the inner sanctuaries increasingly restricted, the innermost shrine completely dark, accessible only to the highest priests. The solar temple inverted this principle. Its most sacred space was the most open, the most exposed to the sky, the most flooded with light. The divine presence was not in the darkness, but in the light. This specific architectural inversion was itself a theological statement, a statement about the specific character of the solar deity's relationship to the human world. Ra was not hidden in darkness, accessible only through the mediation of priestly specialists who performed the ceremonies that sustained the divine presence. Ra was present in the light that everyone could see. The solar temple was the place where that ubiquitous presence was specifically honored and ritually engaged, but it was not the exclusive location of the divine. It was the architectural focus of a theology whose deity was everywhere the sun shone. This dimension of the Fifth Dynasty solar theology, the specific openness of the divine to the world, the specific visibility of the divine in the natural phenomenon of the sun's daily passage, is one of the most important and most underappreciated features of the Egyptian religious tradition's development, and it began with Userkaf. The following sections examine the specific evidence for this beginning in the detail it deserves. One more foundational element requires attention before this account can move fully into the specifics of Userkaf's reign: the question of what exactly the ancient Egyptians understood by the sun cult and why it mattered in the specific institutional context of the Old Kingdom at the transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Dynasty. The sun Ra, the solar disk, the Aten, the specific luminous presence in the sky, that the Egyptians called by many names across the different phases of their religious tradition, was the most immediately accessible of all divine presences in the Egyptian world, not accessible in the sense of personally approachable, as the local gods of specific places were approachable through the specific rituals maintained at their specific temples, accessible in the sense of universally visible. Everywhere the sun shone, Ra was present. The daily cycle of the sun's rising, transit and setting was most unpredictable and the most cosmologically significant of all natural regularities, and the Egyptian theological tradition had been developing its interpretation of this cycle since the earliest phases of the dynastic period. The solar cycle was a daily enactment of the cosmic narrative. The sun's emergence from the eastern horizon each morning was the daily reenactment of the creation, the restoration of order from the darkness that the night represented. The sun's passage across the sky was the daily journey of Ra through the upper world, the world visible to human eyes. The sun's disappearance at the western horizon was the daily death and the daily descent into the underworld, where the solar bark travelled through the 12 hours of the night, defeating the forces of chaos and emerging renewed at the eastern horizon each dawn. This specific narrative, the solar journey as the cosmic archetype of death and rebirth, of order against chaos, of the daily renewal of the created world, was the theological framework within which the pyramid ideology operated, and within which the solar temple's theology was developed. The king's pyramid was the specific mechanism through which the dead king joined Ra's solar journey. The solar temple was the specific place where the living king's connection to the ongoing daily journey was ritually maintained. The Fifth Dynasty's architectural innovation, the solar temple alongside the pyramid, was therefore not a departure from the existing theology. It was an elaboration of it, a specific new architectural expression of a dimension of the royal theology that had always been present but had not previously found its own monumental form. Userkaf gave it that form, and in giving it that form, he set in motion the specific development of the solar theological tradition that would characterize the Fifth Dynasty's most distinctive contribution to Egyptian civilization. Now the foundation is truly complete. The scale is established. The theological context is clear. The man at the beginning of the arc is visible in his specific historical circumstances. The detailed examination of his specific achievements follows in the sections that constitute the heart of this account. The British Egyptologist John Romer, whose comprehensive history of the Old Kingdom has been one of the most readable modern accounts of the pyramid building period, described the transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Dynasty as one of the most significant transformations in the history of the Egyptian state. A transformation that was, as he noted, invisible from a distance but profound in its specific institutional and ideological consequences. The pyramids kept being built, the administrative apparatus kept functioning, the artistic traditions kept developing, but the specific theological center of gravity of the royal ideology shifted, and that shift, initiated by Userkaf in the specific form of the solar temple, had consequences that persisted across the next 1,000 years of Egyptian religious history. Understanding the shift requires examining it at its source. The source is Userkaf, and the examination begins now. The examination begins at Saqqara, at the ruined pyramid that most tourists walk past without stopping, in the shadow of Djoser's great enclosure, where the first king of the Fifth Dynasty chose to build his monument in deliberate proximity to the founding structure of the pyramid tradition. It begins there, and then it moves to the desert north of Abusir, where the solar temple's foundations are visible in the sand, and to the museum case in Cairo, where the extraordinary sculptural fragments from Userkaf's mortuary temple demonstrate why the Fifth Dynasty's artistic legacy is one of the most important in the entire history of the ancient world. The examination begins with the pyramid, with the man who built it, and with the extraordinary historical moment that his reign represented. That moment was not simple, it was not uncomplicated, and the complexity is the most interesting thing about it. The complexity is what this account is built to convey. The complexity of a reign that was, in its specific historical moment, the specific expression of a specific theological and institutional development whose consequences were far larger than the modest scale of Userkaf's pyramid might suggest. The pyramid is modest. The consequences were not, and the gap between the modest pyramid and the extraordinary consequences is the specific thing about Userkaf's reign that this account most urgently wants the listener to understand. That understanding builds now, section by section, until the full picture is assembled, and the name of the founder of the Fifth Dynasty Sun cult takes its proper place in the story of one of the most extraordinary civilizations the human world has produced. Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, the man who built the first solar temple, the king whose modest pyramid stands next to Djoser's great enclosure, as if acknowledging that the tradition he was developing had its roots in the oldest and deepest foundations of the Egyptian building program. His name deserves to be known. His story begins in full now. The numbers are worth noting before the detailed examination begins. Userkaf ruled for approximately 7 years, by the most widely accepted modern scholarly estimate, a relatively short reign by Old Kingdom standards, shorter than the long reigns of the Fourth Dynasty builders, and shorter than several of his own Fifth Dynasty successors. In those 7 years, he built his pyramid, built the first solar temple, produced the sculptural program that defined the artistic standard for the subsequent Old Kingdom, and established the theological and institutional framework that the Fifth Dynasty would develop across the century and a half that followed his founding reign. 7 years, an extraordinary amount accomplished in a relatively short time. The founder's energy concentrated in the founding moment, before the routine of a longer reign could dilute the specific clarity of the initial vision. The foundation fully laid, the arc fully set, the subsequent rulers left to build on it. That foundation, and the 7-year reign in which it was laid, are the subject of the following sections. The core problem of Userkaf's reign was the same problem that every founder faces at the beginning of a new order, the problem of legitimacy after transition. But it was this problem in its most specific and most demanding form, because the transition Userkaf was managing was not the simple transition from one ruler to another within an established dynasty. It was a transition that appears, from the available evidence, to have involved a genuine change in the ruling family, a genuine shift in the theological center of the royal ideology, and a genuine reorganization of the relationship between the pharaonic authority and the priestly establishment whose ritual maintenance of the divine order sustained the king's legitimacy. Understanding the depth of this problem requires understanding what the Fourth Dynasty had been. The Fourth Dynasty was, by any historical measure, the most audaciously ambitious ruling house in the history of the early Egyptian state. Sneferu, its founder, built at least 3 major pyramids in a sustained building program that consumed an extraordinary proportion of the Egyptian state's resources and produced the first successful smooth-sided pyramids in the history of Egyptian architecture. Khufu, his son, built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest single building project in the history of the ancient world, a structure that used approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, weighing an average of approximately 2.5 tons each, reaching a height of approximately 146 meters in its original form. Khafre built the second Giza pyramid and the Great Sphinx. Menkaure built the third, smaller pyramid at Giza. The Fourth Dynasty's building program was, in aggregate, the most intensive organized deployment of human labor and organizational capacity that the ancient world had yet seen. This program was, among other things, a statement of theological audacity. The assertion that the pharaoh was so divine, so absolutely identified with the solar deity, that the resources of the entire Egyptian state could be properly devoted to building the mechanism of his eternal solar journey. The pyramid was not simply a tomb. It was, in the specific theological understanding of the period, the pharaoh's specific instrument for participating in Ra's solar journey after death, the physical expression of the king's divine nature, the material form of his cosmic function. The scale of the Fourth Dynasty's assertion of royal divinity was, however, not without its institutional costs. A theology that claimed the pharaoh was so divine that his eternal journey required the construction of the largest building in the world was a theology that placed enormous institutional demands on the Egyptian state, demands that the specific administrative apparatus of the Fourth Dynasty managed with extraordinary efficiency, but that were, over the long run, not indefinitely sustainable at the Fourth Dynasty's most ambitious scale. The Fourth Dynasty's final rulers, Userkaf, who built a large mastaba tomb rather than a pyramid, apparently breaking with the pure pyramid tradition, and the specific transition to Userkaf, suggest a period of institutional recalibration. The most ambitious pyramid building program in Egyptian history appears to have reached a point of institutional stress, and the Fifth Dynasty's reorganization of the royal theological agenda was, in part, a response to that stress. But here is the core problem in its deepest form. The reorganization could not simply be a reduction of ambition, a scaling back of the Fourth Dynasty's extraordinary claims, a new dynasty that presented itself as simply doing less than its predecessors, building smaller pyramids, making more modest theological claims, would have been providing the precise evidence that its critics needed to challenge its legitimacy. The Fifth Dynasty's legitimacy depended on its ability to make a positive theological and architectural claim, to present its specific approach not as a retreat from the Fourth Dynasty's ambitions, but as an advance, a deeper and truer expression of the royal theological program. The solar temple was the specific solution to this specific problem. By building the solar temple alongside the pyramid, by adding a new architectural form to the royal building program, rather than simply replacing the pyramid with something smaller, Userkaf was making a positive claim that his dynasty's theological approach was not less than the Fourth Dynasty's, but more comprehensive, more theologically sophisticated, more fully expressive of the complete range of the divine order that the pharaonic ideology was designed to maintain. The solar temple said, yes, we acknowledge the pyramid tradition, and we build within it, but we also acknowledge the sun god Ra directly, in his own architectural form, with his own dedicated institution. We are not simply the heirs of the pyramid builders. We are the kings who have added to the pyramid tradition the specifically solar dimension that was always present within it, but had not yet found its own monumental expression. This was a specific theological argument expressed in architectural form, and it was, in the specific conditions of the Fourth-Fifth Dynasty transition, an extraordinarily effective argument. Effective enough to define the Fifth Dynasty's specific character and to sustain the dynasty through 9 successive rulers across approximately 150 years. The problem of legitimacy after transition was solved by theological innovation expressed in architectural novelty. The solar temple was the innovation. Userkaf was the innovator. But the core problem had another dimension, the artistic and sculptural dimension, that requires separate examination because the quality of the sculptural program at Userkaf's mortuary temple was itself a statement about legitimacy that operated through a completely different channel from the theological argument of the solar temple. The fragments of painted relief carving recovered from the ruins of Userkaf's mortuary temple at Saqqara during the excavations conducted by Jean-Philippe Lauer and Cecil Firth in the 1930s CE, and continued by more recent teams in subsequent decades, include what specialists in Old Kingdom art have consistently described as some of the finest relief carving produced in any period of Egyptian history. The specific quality of the carving, the precision of the outlines, the subtlety of the relief modeling, the sophistication of the painted surface treatment is not simply excellent by the standards of the period. It represents a specific advance in the technical mastery of Egyptian relief carving that was not matched until the mature Fifth Dynasty work, and that was clearly intended in the context of a new dynasty establishing its legitimacy as a statement of cultural ambition and royal magnificence. A new dynasty that immediately produces the finest sculpture yet seen in the history of the Egyptian artistic tradition is a dynasty making a specific claim about its relationship to the cultural standards of the civilization. The sculptural program at Userkaf's mortuary temple was not simply decorative. It was itself a legitimacy argument, a demonstration that the new dynasty was not only theologically innovative but artistically supreme, that the kingdom had not declined in quality or ambition with the transition from the Fourth Dynasty, but had entered a new phase of cultural excellence. And it gets more specifically remarkable when you look at what the sculptures actually show. Among the most significant surviving fragments from Userkaf's mortuary temple is a colossal head, a massive stone head, approximately 65 centimeters high, representing the king in the red crown of Lower Egypt. This head, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is one of the most powerful portraits of individual royal authority to survive from the Old Kingdom, and its scale and its quality are both extraordinary for its period. The specific expressiveness of the face, the specific quality of individuality that the sculptor achieved within the formal conventions of the Egyptian portraiture tradition, gives the head a presence and a directness that make it one of the most immediately striking objects in a museum that contains some of the finest ancient art in the world. But the most remarkable quality of the head is not its size or its immediate visual power. It is the specific fact that the king is shown wearing the red crown, the crown of Lower Egypt, the Delta, the Northern Kingdom, and looking not toward the viewer, but slightly downward and to the side, in a pose of active engagement with the world that is distinctively different from the frontal, timeless gaze of most Egyptian royal portraiture. This deviation from the standard conventions of Egyptian royal representation, the specific choice to show the king in a pose of engaged, directional attention rather than eternal frontal dignity, is the kind of artistic decision that specialists spend careers analyzing. It suggests a specific quality of the sculptural program at Userkaf's temple, that the artist or the artistic program was willing to push against the conventional forms of the royal portrait tradition in the service of expressive effectiveness, that the artistic ambition of the program was not simply technical but conceptual, and that the result was something genuinely new in the history of Egyptian royal portraiture. Here is what makes this truly significant. when you look at the broader context of the Fifth Dynasty's artistic achievements. The artistic tradition inaugurated by Userkaf's sculptural program was the specific tradition from which the Fifth Dynasty's most celebrated artistic achievements grew. The reliefs at the sun temples of Nusere and his predecessors, reliefs that are among the finest decorative programs in the history of ancient art, whose naturalistic representations of animals, plants, and human activities pushed the boundaries of Egyptian representational convention with a confidence and a quality unmatched before or after, were the mature expressions of an artistic impulse that the sculptural program at Userkaf's temple had first articulated. The core problem was legitimacy. The solution was innovation, theological innovation expressed in the solar temple, and artistic innovation expressed in the sculptural program of the mortuary temple. Both innovations were genuine advances, rather than simply departures from the Fourth Dynasty's approach, and both define the specific character of the Fifth Dynasty's contribution to the Egyptian civilizational tradition for the entire subsequent century and a half of the dynasty's existence. Userkaf initiated both. The man at the beginning of the arc made the arc possible. The specific character of the transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Dynasty, the specific political and institutional mechanism by which Userkaf came to the throne, deserves more careful examination than the broad theological framework has yet provided, because the political reality of the transition shapes the understanding of why the specific innovations of Userkaf's reign took the specific form they did. The ancient king list tradition, preserved in the Turin canon, the Abydos king list, and other sources, treats the Fourth and Fifth Dynasties as distinct units, implying a change of ruling family at the transition. The specific reason for this change, whether it was the natural extinction of the male line of the Fourth Dynasty ruling family, a political revolution, a succession dispute resolved in favor of a different faction, or the recognition of a collateral branch of the royal family, is not clearly documented in the surviving evidence. The Westcar Papyrus's story of the Fifth Dynasty kings as the literal sons of Ra, born from the union of the solar deity with the wife of the high priest of Ra at Heliopolis, is the specific ancient tradition about the dynasty's origins that most directly addresses this question, and its specific character as a mythological text, rather than a historical record, tells us something important. The fact that the dynasty's founding claim was articulated in terms of divine parentage, in terms of a specific, personal connection to Ra that bypassed the normal channels of human succession, suggests that the dynasty's legitimacy was, in some sense, in need of the kind of theological authentication that a story of divine origins provides. A dynasty with impeccable hereditary credentials typically does not need to claim divine origins for its founder beyond the standard Son of Ra language that all pharaohs used. The specific elaboration of the divine origin claim in the Westcar Papyrus tradition, the specific narrative of the priest's wife and the literal divine paternity, suggests that the Fifth Dynasty's connection to the preceding royal family was, at minimum, not entirely straightforward. The Egyptologist Miroslav Verner, whose decades of work at Abusir give him the most detailed modern scholarly familiarity with the Fifth Dynasty evidence, noted in his comprehensive treatment of the period that the specific character of the Fifth Dynasty's founding legitimacy claim, its appeal to divine paternity and priestly authorization, rather than simply to dynastic succession, reflected the specific political reality of a dynasty that came to power with its theological orientation as its primary legitimizing credential, rather than its genealogical credentials. Whether this meant that Userkaf was genuinely not of the direct Fourth Dynasty bloodline, or simply that the specific theological agenda he represented was so distinctive that it required a specific founding mythology to legitimize it, the practical consequence was the same. His dynasty's claim to authority was grounded in its relationship to the solar theology and the Heliopolitan priestly establishment, rather than simply in hereditary succession. This specific grounding of the dynastic claim in a religious program, in a theological relationship rather than simply in genealogy, was itself an institutional innovation of significant a consequence. It meant that the Fifth Dynasty's authority was, in a specific way, more theologically dependent than the Fourth Dynasty's had been. The Fourth Dynasty kings' authority rested on their personal divine nature. They were, in the most extreme expressions of the pyramid ideology, themselves divine, themselves Ra in human form. The Fifth Dynasty kings' authority rested on their relationship to Ra. They were the sons of Ra, the servants of Ra, the representatives of Ra's order on earth, dependent on the divine rather than identical with it. This theological shift, from divine king to king who serves the divine, had specific institutional consequences that the rest of this section must trace, because those consequences illuminate the specific character of the Fifth Dynasty's relationship to the priestly establishment, and the specific way in which the Solar Temple program expressed and sustained that relationship. If the king was divine himself, the priestly establishment's primary function was to serve the king, to provide the ritual context within which the king's divine nature was expressed and maintained. The priests were, in this theology, secondary to the king in the ultimate theological hierarchy. If the king was the son of Ra, the representative of Ra's order, but not identical with the divine itself, then the relationship between the king and the priestly establishment was more complex. The king derived his legitimacy from his relationship to Ra. The priests were the institutional guardians of the Ra cult. The king's authority was therefore, in a specific sense, mediated through the priestly institution, dependent on the priestly acknowledgement of the king's connection to the divine order that the priests maintained. The Solar Temple program was, in this reading, a specific institutional expression of this more complex relationship. By building sun temples, by creating institutional settings where the solar cult could be maintained and developed by a dedicated priestly establishment, the Fifth Dynasty kings were, in a specific sense, investing in the institutional foundation of their own legitimacy. The sun temples were not simply expressions of royal piety. They were institutional investments in the specific priestly establishment, whose theological recognition was the foundation of the royal authority. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated institutional arrangement. The king builds the institution whose theological endorsement sustains the king's legitimacy. The institution serves the king by providing the theological framework within which the king's authority is grounded. The king serves the institution by providing the resources that allow it to function at the scale and the quality that the divine deserves. A mutual reinforcement, a symbiosis of royal authority and priestly institutional capacity that sustained the Fifth Dynasty across 150 years. Userkaf built the first element of this institutional structure. He built the Solar Temple. He initiated the symbiosis. And the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary cultural, artistic, and institutional achievements across the century and a half that followed were the expression of the specific institutional arrangement that his founding program had established. This is the deepest dimension of the core problem and its solution, not simply the legitimacy question in the narrow political sense. The specific institutional architecture, the mutual reinforcement of royal authority and priestly institutional capacity that the Solar Temple program expressed and that sustained the Fifth Dynasty at its remarkable level of cultural achievement. It gets stranger and more interesting when you look at the specific evidence for how this institutional architecture actually functioned. Because the Abbasid papyri, the oldest surviving administrative papyri in Egyptian history, give us a window into the daily operation of the mortuary establishment that is without parallel in the surviving evidence for the Old Kingdom. The Abbasid papyri were found in the late 19th century in the debris associated with the mortuary temple of Neferikari, a Fifth Dynasty ruler who succeeded Sahur, who succeeded Userkaf. They are imperfectly dated. Their specific year of discovery and the specific circumstances of their acquisition by the museums and collections where they are now held, distributed between the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the British Museum in London, and other collections, are not fully documented. But their content is unambiguous and extraordinary. They are the daily records of the mortuary establishment, the roster of priests on duty, the schedule of the rituals performed, the inventory of temple equipment, the records of inspections, and the notes of specific administrative decisions. Reading these documents gives a picture of the Old Kingdom mortuary establishment that is both immediately accessible and profoundly illuminating. The priests were organized in rotating groups called files, a system that divided the priestly staff into specific units, each responsible for the maintenance of the establishment during a specific period of the year, rotating in and out of duty on a regular schedule. The specific duties of each file, the offerings to be prepared, the rituals to be performed, the equipment to be maintained, were recorded with the specific administrative precision of a bureaucratic system that took its obligations seriously. The equipment inventories are particularly revealing. The mortuary temple required specific material equipment to function, the specific vessels for the offering ceremonies, the specific tools for the maintenance of the complex, the specific objects associated with specific rituals. These were tracked with the care that the administrative tradition applied to all significant state property, recorded, inventoried, accounted for when they were damaged or lost. What the Abbasid papyri demonstrate, taken together, is that the Fifth Dynasty mortuary establishments were genuine functioning institutions, not simply physical structures built in honor of the dead king, but living administrative organizations, staffed by trained personnel, operating according to formal schedules and procedures, maintained with the specific material resources that institutional functioning required. This institutional sophistication, visible in the detail of the Abbasid papyri, in a way that is not visible for any earlier period of Egyptian history, was itself the product of the specific institutional architecture that Userkaf had initiated. The mortuary temple was not simply a ritual space. It was an administrative institution, a component of the broader institutional landscape of the Egyptian state, managed with the same systematic care that the administrative tradition applied to every other significant state institution. The core problem of Userkaf's reign, the problem of legitimacy after transition, was solved not simply by the theological innovation of the solar temple or the artistic innovation of the sculptural program. It was solved, ultimately, by the institutional architecture that those innovations expressed, the specific arrangement by which the royal building program created functioning institutional entities, sun temples, mortuary establishments that sustained the specific theological program of the dynasty across the lives and deaths of successive rulers. The solar temple was a theology, the mortuary temple was an institution. Together, they were the specific solution to the specific problem of sustaining a dynasty's legitimacy across time, of ensuring that the founding theological claim was not simply the personal expression of the founding ruler, but the institutional expression of a functioning religious and administrative organization capable of sustaining that claim generation after generation. This is the institutional genius of the Fifth Dynasty founding program, and it was Userkaf's genius. The following sections examine the specific evidence for this genius in the specific monuments and objects and documents that the archaeological record has preserved. The specific archaeological evidence for Userkaf's reign is distributed across several sites and several categories of material. The pyramid complex at Saqqara, with its associated mortuary temple, and the extraordinary sculptural fragments recovered from its excavation. The Sun Temple at Abu Ghurab north of Abu Sir, whose foundations are partially preserved. The king list and administrative documents that place his reign in the chronological framework of the Old Kingdom, and the comparative evidence from the rest of the Fifth Dynasty, the subsequent solar temples, the artistic traditions, the administrative developments that allow his founding contributions to be assessed against the tradition he initiated. This evidence, assembled and examined carefully, produces the picture of a specific ruler at a specific moment of historical transition, deploying specific institutional and theological innovations to solve the specific problem of founding a new dynasty's legitimacy. The picture is not complete. The evidence is fragmentary in ways that the distance of 4,000 years makes unavoidable, but it is coherent and compelling enough to tell the story this account is working to tell. The story is now ready to be told in its full archaeological and historical detail. The core problem has been named, the solutions have been sketched, the institutional context has been established. Now the chapters of exploration provide the specific evidence, building by building, object by object, document by document, through which the full picture of Userkaf's reign and its significance becomes visible. The exploration begins with the discovery moment, with the specific excavations that recovered the evidence for Userkaf's reign from the centuries of sand and rubble that had covered it, and then moves through the specific monuments and objects and documents that constitute the evidence. 5 distinct chapters of exploration follow. Together, they make the case for a verdict that the evidence demands, that Userkaf, founder of the Fifth Dynasty and initiator of the Sun Cult program, was one of the most institutionally significant rulers of the Old Kingdom, and that his specific contributions to the Egyptian civilizational tradition have been systematically underappreciated in the popular telling of the ancient world's story. The case begins now. The Fifth Dynasty Sun Cult is the most distinctive feature of the dynasty's cultural legacy, and Userkaf is its founder. Understanding what the Sun Cult was, why it was introduced when it was, and what institutional and cultural consequences it produced, requires the specific examination of the specific evidence that the following sections provide. The exploration begins with the Sun Temple itself, the architectural innovation that expressed the theological program in its most immediate and most powerful material form. The Sun Temple at Abu Ghurab, the Benben stone, the open courtyard facing the sun, the sacrificial altar in the light. That is where the exploration begins. That is where Userkaf's founding innovation is most directly visible. And that is where the full story of the Fifth Dynasty's Sun Cult begins to become clear. The story begins now. But before moving to the specific evidence, one more element of the core problem requires acknowledgement. The specific reason that Userkaf's contributions have been so systematically invisible in the popular telling of Egyptian history. The answer is the same answer that appears at every point in this series. Userkaf built foundations, and the foundations are always in the shadow of what was built on them. The Fourth Dynasty pyramids at Giza are among the most famous structures in human history. The Fifth Dynasty Sun Temples at Abu Ghurab and Abu Sir are known only to specialists. The Sixth Dynasty pyramid texts are recognized as foundational religious literature. Userkaf's founding contribution to the theological arc that produced both the Sun Temples and the pyramid texts is invisible to all but the most careful scholarly attention. Invisible foundations are still foundations, and the Fifth Dynasty Sun Cult's extraordinary artistic, theological, and institutional achievements grew from the foundation that Userkaf built. His invisibility does not diminish his significance. It simply demonstrates, one more time, the specific pattern that this series has been tracing throughout, that the most consequential contributions to a civilization are often made by the people who work at the foundations rather than at the monuments. The monuments are famous. The foundations deserve their accounting. That accounting begins now. The accounting, given at the scale and with the care that the evidence deserves, is the subject of the following sections of this account. It is an accounting that reaches from the ruined pyramid at Saqqara to the extraordinary relief carvings in the Cairo Museum, from the foundations of the Sun Temple at Abu Ghurab to the daily administrative records of the Abu Sir papyri, from the colossal stone head in the Red Crown to the theological arc that ended in the pyramid texts, all of it connected, all of it growing from the specific founding moment that Userkaf's reign represented, all of it awaiting the full examination that the following chapters provide. The examination is about to begin. It is long overdue, and now finally it begins. The following chapters constitute the full archaeological, historical, and institutional examination of Userkaf's reign that this account has been promising. The evidence is rich. The story is extraordinary. The founding of the Fifth Dynasty Sun Cult was one of the most important single institutional developments in the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, and the man who initiated it deserves the recognition that the silence around his name has too long denied him. Userkaf, founder of the Fifth Dynasty, initiator of the sun cult, builder of the first solar temple, patron of the artistic tradition that produced the finest relief sculpture of the Old Kingdom, the man whose 7-year reign set the arc of 150 years of cultural and institutional achievement. His story, in its full and proper telling, occupies the chapters that follow. The chapters that follow are organized around the specific evidence that best illuminates the specific character of his reign. Chapter 1 on the discovery of his monuments. Chapter 2 on the Solar Temple program. Chapter 3 on the pyramid and its sculptural program. Chapter 4 on the Westcar papyrus and the question of his origins. Chapter 5 on the Fifth Dynasty's artistic achievements and their relationship to his founding program. Chapter 6 on the Abbassir papyri and the institutional life they reveal. Chapter 7 on the broader arc that his founding moment set in motion. And beyond that, the final chapters that connect his story to the larger narrative of the civilizational tradition this series has been tracing. Collectively, they constitute the full accounting. Individually, each is a chapter in the story of the founder who made the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary century and a half of achievement possible. The first chapter begins now. More than 4,000 years of sand and silence have covered the evidence for Userkaf's reign. A century of systematic archaeological work has uncovered enough of it to tell the story. And the story, told in its full complexity and with its contextual richness, is one of the most instructive and most underappreciated stories in the history of the ancient world. Let the uncovering continue. The chapters follow. The chapters follow, and in following, they give Userkaf the recognition that the evidence demands and the silence has withheld. He was there at the beginning of the Fifth Dynasty. He was there at the beginning of the sun cult. He was there at the beginning of the artistic tradition that the Fifth Dynasty's finest relief carvings express. And he was there in his pyramid at Saqqara and his solar temple at Abu Ghurab, connecting the founding tradition of the pyramid builders to the theological program that the subsequent 150 years of the Fifth Dynasty would develop and elaborate. 4,400 years later, the exploration of what he built begins in earnest. The exploration begins now. This is the core problem stated in its fullest form. The problem of legitimacy after transition, solved by theological and artistic innovation, sustained by institutional architecture, and expressed in the specific monuments and objects and documents that the following chapters examine. The core has been stated. The chapters follow, beginning with the specific discovery moment that gave the modern world its first clear view of what Userkaf actually built. That discovery moment is the place where the story of Userkaf in the modern world begins, and it is where the exploration begins. The discovery moment is in the 1930s CE, in the excavations at Saqqara that began to recover the extraordinary sculptural fragments from Userkaf's mortuary temple. It is where Chapter 1 begins. The chapters begin, the evidence speaks. The founder of the Fifth Dynasty sun cult comes into view. 4,000 years of obscurity end here. 4,000 years is a very long time to be obscured. The obscurity ends here in the following chapters, where the evidence for Userkaf's reign is examined with the full care and the full scholarly context that it deserves. The ending of the obscurity is the beginning of the recognition. The recognition begins with Chapter 1 and the man who first glimpsed the extraordinary quality of what Userkaf had built. Chapter 1 begins now with the excavations at Saqqara that first gave the modern world a clear view of the extraordinary artistic program at Userkaf's mortuary temple. The exploration of the founder of the Fifth Dynasty sun cult begins at that specific excavation moment and then widens to encompass the full range of the evidence for his reign. Now, the exploration begins. Chapter 1. The excavations at Saqqara in the 1930s CE. The French Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer and his British colleague Cecil Firth were conducting systematic excavations at the Saqqara Plateau, the vast archaeological site south of Cairo that contains more Old Kingdom monuments than any other single location in Egypt, dominated by Giza's step pyramid complex, but also holding dozens of other pyramid complexes, mastaba tombs, and subsidiary structures from across the Old Kingdom and subsequent periods. Lauer was one of the most important figures in the archaeology of the Old Kingdom, spending decades on the systematic excavation and reconstruction of the step pyramid complex in a career that stretched from the 1920s through the 1980s. His work at Saqqara produced the most comprehensive modern understanding of Djoser's revolutionary building program and the specific architectural traditions it inaugurated, but it also, through the systematic clearance and documentation of the wider Saqqara plateau, produced the specific discoveries associated with Userkaf's pyramid complex that gave the modern world its first clear picture of the extraordinary sculptural program that Userkaf's mortuary temple had contained. What Lauer and Firth found in the ruins of Userkaf's mortuary temple, a modest structure on the south side of Userkaf's pyramid, already heavily damaged by the ancient quarrying and subsequent construction that had reduced the pyramid itself to a rubble mound, were fragments of painted relief carving whose quality exceeded anything that had been expected from a pyramid complex of this period. The relief carving, the specific technique of cutting the design slightly below the flat surface of the stone, creating an image that projects very slightly from the background, was the primary medium of the Old Kingdom's decorative program, covering the walls of mortuary temples, tombs, and eventually the major temples of the later periods with the extraordinary visual narratives that are one of the defining features of Egyptian cultural achievement. The relief fragments from Userkaf's mortuary temple were not simply good, they were extraordinary. The specific quality of the carving, the precision of the incised outlines, the subtle modelling of the relief surfaces, the sophistication of the compositional arrangements was, in the assessment of every specialist who has examined them, among the finest produced in the entire Old Kingdom. The specific fragments showing birds in a papyrus marsh, herons and butterflies and small animals among the stems of the papyrus thicket, observed and recorded with a naturalistic precision that had not been seen in Egyptian art before this period, were particularly remarkable. A confidence in the depiction of the natural world, a willingness to observe specific species and specific behaviors rather than simply generic animal forms, that was genuinely new in the history of Egyptian representational art. Lauer recognized the significance of these fragments immediately. He documented them with the meticulous care that his systematic approach demanded, photographed them, and published them in the specific technical publications that the specialist scholarly community followed. But the fragment's significance extended beyond their individual artistic quality. They were evidence for the specific character of Userkaf's artistic program, evidence that the founder of the Fifth Dynasty had, in the specific context of establishing his dynasty's legitimacy, made artistic excellence a central element of the founding statement. A new dynasty that immediately produces the finest relief carving in the history of the Egyptian artistic tradition is making a specific claim. The claim that the cultural standards of the civilization have not declined with the dynastic transition, but have, if anything, advanced. The fragments from Userkaf's mortuary temple were the physical evidence for that claim. The colossal head found in the vicinity of the mortuary temple, the massive stone portrait of Userkaf in the red crown, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, was another element of the same claim. The head, by the assessment of specialists in Old Kingdom sculpture, is one of the most powerful royal portraits to survive from the ancient world, a face of genuine individual presence within the formal conventions of the pharaonic portraiture tradition, a combination of personal expressiveness and institutional authority that was not simply technically impressive but conceptually innovative. The specific innovation of the slightly downward and sideward gaze, the pose of engaged directional attention rather than the standard frontal timelessness of Egyptian royal portraits, has been the subject of sustained scholarly discussion. Dorothea Arnold, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's specialist in Egyptian sculpture, analysed the head in her comprehensive study of Old Kingdom portraiture and described it as representing a specific turning point in the development of the Egyptian royal portrait. The moment when the specific expressive possibilities of the medium were being pushed in a direction that the subsequent Fifth Dynasty sculpture would develop into the most refined and most varied royal portraiture, in the history of ancient Egypt. If the fragments from the mortuary temple reliefs represent the founding of the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary tradition of narrative relief carving, the colossal head represents the founding of the dynasty's equally extraordinary tradition of royal portrait sculpture. Both traditions, initiated in Userkaf's reign, were developed and refined across the century and a half that followed, producing some of the finest art of the ancient world. Chapter 2. The Solar Temple at Abu Ghurab. The foundations of Userkaf's solar temple at Abu Ghurab, north of Abusir on the desert edge, on the elevated ground overlooking the Nile Valley, have been known since the late 19th century surveys, but have been excavated and documented systematically only in the modern era. The best preserved of the Fifth Dynasty solar temples is not Userkaf's, but that of his grandson Nusere, built at the same site approximately 50 years after Userkaf's foundation, and representing the mature elaboration of the solar temple form that Userkaf had introduced. The relationship between Userkaf's founding structure and Nusere's later elaboration is, archaeologically, like the relationship between a sketch and a finished painting. The same compositional idea, the same spatial organization, the same theological program, but developed to a higher level of architectural refinement and decorative completeness. The solar temple form, as established by Userkaf's founding example, consisted of three primary elements. The Valley Temple, connected to the Nile by a causeway, was the entrance and reception point for the solar cult's ritual activities. The place where the offerings and the participants arrived from the productive world of the valley before ascending to the sacred precinct above. The causeway, connecting the Valley Temple to the main precinct, was a processional path elevated above the desert surface, allowing the approach to the sacred site to be experienced as a gradual ascent, a progressive movement from the mundane to the divine. The main precinct, at the desert edge, contained the massive Benben stone, the squat, almost pyramidal obelisk form that represented the original sacred stone of the Heliopolitan solar cult, and the large open courtyard with its alabaster offering altar where the solar rituals were performed. The specific architectural form of the Benben was not the tall, slender obelisk of the later periods, not the elegant needle forms that Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III and many subsequent rulers erected at Karnak. The Fifth Dynasty solar temple Benben was a massive, squat structure, broader at the base and tapering toward the top in a form closer to a pyramid than to the later obelisk. Its specific form expressed a specific theology. The Benben as the primordial mound, the first solid ground to emerge from the waters of chaos at the creation, the place where the solar deity first alighted. The solar temple was not simply a place of worship. It was a specific cosmological representation, a physical expression of the moment of creation, maintained in a permanent architectural form that allowed the daily reenactment of the creation to be ritually performed in the most appropriate possible setting. The massive alabaster altar in the forecourt of the solar temple's main precinct is one of the most important pieces of surviving evidence for the specific character of the solar rituals. The altar, the best example is from Nusere's temple, now in the Berlin Museum, is a large circular table supported by 4 individual supporting blocks and topped with a flat offering surface, with the hieroglyph for offerings incorporated into its design in a way that makes the altar itself a visual statement of its function. The specific size and the specific alabaster material, white, luminous, almost translucent, were not incidental choices. Alabaster in the Egyptian tradition was associated with the solar deity, and the luminous quality of the material in full sunlight was the specific visual echo of the solar light that the temple's theology celebrated. Chapter 3. The pyramid and its modest scale. The specific location and the specific scale of Userkaf's pyramid, at Saqqara, modest in comparison to the Fourth Dynasty giants, deliberately adjacent to the founding monument of the tradition, reveals the specific character of his relationship to his architectural inheritance. The Pyramid of Userkaf is a small structure by the standards of the pyramid building tradition. Its base measures approximately 73 meters on each side, compared to the Great Pyramids, approximately 230 meters, and it originally rose to a height of approximately 49 meters. Its limestone casing has been almost entirely stripped by the ancient quarrying operations that reduced it to the rubble mound visible today. Inside, the burial chamber survives in its essential elements, providing the specific evidence. The architectural remains, the surviving stone, the seal impressions and other objects associated with the tomb that allows the structure to be dated and attributed with confidence. The specific choice of Saqqara rather than Abusir or Giza for Userkaf's pyramid was, as argued in the previous section, a deliberate statement about his relationship to the founding tradition of the pyramid program by placing his pyramid at the northeastern corner of Djoser's great enclosure. The monument that had initiated the pyramid tradition, Userkaf, was claiming a specific relationship to the founding moment of the tradition. The claim that his dynasty was not simply the continuation of the Fourth Dynasty, but a return to the original founding impulse of the pyramid program, represented at its most historically and theologically fundamental site. The modest scale of the pyramid alongside this location is itself part of the statement. A pyramid the same size as Khufu's would have competed with the Fourth Dynasty's achievement, rather than acknowledging it. A pyramid that was clearly smaller, placed in deliberate adjacency to the founding tradition's most ancient monument, made a different statement. The acknowledgement of the tradition's depth combined with the specific claim that the new theological program, the Solar Temple, was the dynasty's primary architectural and institutional contribution to that tradition. The math is striking when you consider the architectural statement of the complex as a whole. The pyramid is modest. The Solar Temple at Abu Ghurab is, in its specific architectural conception, innovative. The mortuary temple at Saqqara contains the finest sculpture yet produced in the pyramid tradition. The composite statement of the three structures together. Modest pyramid, acknowledging the tradition. Innovative solar temple, extending the tradition in a new direction. Extraordinary sculpture elevating the cultural standard, is the specific architectural expression of Userkaf's founding theological and institutional program. Three structures, three statements, one coherent program. The founder of the Fifth Dynasty understood exactly what he was doing. Chapter 4. The Westkha Papyrus and the Question of Origins. The Westkha Papyrus, preserved on a Middle Kingdom papyrus now in the Berlin Museum, named for the English collector Henry Westkha, who acquired it in the 19th century CE, is one of the most remarkable literary texts to survive from ancient Egypt. It presents a series of tales told at the court of the Fourth Dynasty King Khufu, framed as entertainments told by Khufu's sons to divert their royal father. The final and most significant of these tales, the tale of Rudjedet and the miraculous birth, is the specific story of the divine origin of the first three Fifth Dynasty kings. In the story, the god Ra decides that three rulers from the family of a priest at the Heliopolitan solar cult will replace the current dynasty. Ra himself fathers three children on Rudjedet, the wife of the priest, children who are described as destined to be kings of Egypt, and who will exercise beneficence and build the sun temples that Ra desires. The births are attended by divine midwives, the goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Meskenet and Heket, along with the god Khnum, who assist in the delivery and provide the divine children with their specific royal destinies. The specific elements of this narrative are worth unpacking because they are not simply conventional mythology. They are the specific theological program of the Fifth Dynasty expressed in literary form. The founder's divine parentage, the solar theological connection, the specific emphasis on the sun temples as the divine commission that the new dynasty will fulfill. The Westkha Papyrus's account of the Fifth Dynasty's origins is, in a very real sense, the theological manifesto of the solar temple program, expressed in the specific medium of narrative fiction. The question of the text's relationship to historical reality is complex. The text clearly cannot be read as a literal historical account. The divine paternity of the Fifth Dynasty kings, the divine midwives at their births, are mythological elements that the ancient Egyptians themselves would have understood in their specific religious, rather than biographical significance. But the text encodes genuine historical information in its mythological framework. The specific connection between the Fifth Dynasty and the Heliopolitan solar cult the specific theological agenda of the Sun Temple program, and the specific legitimacy claim that connected the dynasty's authority to a direct divine commission rather than simply to hereditary succession. Whether Userkaf was genuinely not of the Fourth Dynasty's direct bloodline, whether the mythological language of divine paternity encodes a historical reality of non-dynastic origin, or whether the myth simply expresses the specific theological orientation of a dynasty that chose to define itself primarily through its solar theological program, is a question that the available evidence does not decisively resolve. What the evidence does show is that the Fifth Dynasty's founding claim was organized around the solar theology in a way that was specifically distinctive from the Fourth Dynasty's approach, and that the Westcar Papyrus's literary expression of this claim was designed to make the specifically divine character of the connection, the paternity of Ra himself, rather than simply the standard Son of Ra language of all pharaohs, as vivid and as theologically immediate as the narrative medium could make it. The literary investment in this specific theological claim, the fact that a major literary work was devoted to elaborating and celebrating the divine origin of the Fifth Dynasty's founding program, is itself evidence for the specific importance of the solar theological connection in the dynasty's legitimacy architecture. Important things generate elaborate justifications. The Westcar Papyrus is an elaborate justification. The thing it justifies was important. Chapter 5. The Fifth Dynasty's artistic achievement and Userkaf's founding role. The artistic achievements of the Fifth Dynasty. The extraordinary relief carvings in the sun temples and mortuary temples of Sahua, Nusere, and their fellow rulers are among the finest produced in the entire history of ancient Egypt, and their relationship to Userkaf's founding program requires explicit examination. The sun temples of Nusere, whose fragmentary decorated walls survive in the Berlin Museum and in the Cairo Museum, contain relief carvings of animals and plants and seasonal scenes that represent, in the assessment of every specialist who has examined them, the finest naturalistic art produced in the Egyptian Old Kingdom. The specific quality of observation, the accuracy of the bird species represented, the specificity of the plant species, the rendered details of animal behavior, was unprecedented in the history of Egyptian art and was not matched in subsequent periods until the New Kingdom artists of the tomb paintings at Deir el-Medina. These extraordinary reliefs did not emerge from nothing. They were the mature expressions of an artistic program that had been developing throughout the Fifth Dynasty, and whose founding impulse was visible in the fragments from Userkaf's mortuary temple. The birds in the papyrus marsh, the naturalistic rendering of the natural world, the confident observation of specific species, all of these qualities were present in embryonic form in the Userkaf mortuary temple fragments, and were developed across the subsequent reigns of the dynasty into the mature achievements of the Nusere Sun Temple reliefs. The connection is not simply temporal, it is artistic and institutional. The specific artistic program of the Fifth Dynasty, the commitment to naturalistic observation, the confidence in rendering specific natural phenomena, the willingness to push the boundaries of the representational conventions, was a specific program sustained across the dynasty by the institutional continuity of the royal workshops and the specific artistic traditions those workshops maintained. Userkaf inaugurated this program. The quality of the work at his mortuary temple, the colossal head, the relief fragments, was the founding statement of the artistic standard that the dynasty would sustain and develop. And the development across 150 years of the Fifth Dynasty's existence produced some of the finest art of the ancient world. Chapter 6. The Abosir Papyri and the institutional life of the Old Kingdom. The Abosir Papyri deserve their own chapter in this account because they represent, in the specific context of understanding Userkaf's institutional legacy, the most direct surviving window into the daily administrative reality of the Old Kingdom state at the period of the Fifth Dynasty's greatest institutional elaboration. The papyri were found in the late 19th century CE, in the debris associated with the mortuary temple of Neferikare at Abusir. the third ruler after Userkaf in the Fifth Dynasty's sequence. They are the oldest administrative papyri in the history of ancient Egypt, and their content, the daily records of the mortuary establishment's institutional functioning, gives a picture of the Old Kingdom administrative world that no other category of evidence provides. What the papyri show is an institution of genuine complexity and genuine sophistication. The file rotation system, the organization of the priestly staff into specific units that rotated in and out of duty on a regular schedule, was a specific administrative innovation that balanced the need for institutional continuity with the practical reality that maintaining a large permanent priestly establishment at a mortuary temple would have been organizationally and financially unsustainable. By rotating the priests through their service obligations, the system distributed the institutional costs across a wider population while maintaining the ritual continuity that the theological understanding of the mortuary establishment required. The administrative documents record specific individual priests by name, specific offerings by type and quantity, specific pieces of equipment by material and condition, specific administrative decisions, and their rationales. They are, in a word, minutes, the minutes of a genuine institutional operation, with all the specific detail that institutional records contain. Miroslav Werner, whose comprehensive study of the Abusir material constitutes the most thorough modern treatment of Fifth Dynasty archaeology, described the papyri as among the most important documentary discoveries in the history of Egyptology. Important not simply for what they say about the specific mortuary establishment, whose records they preserve, but for what they reveal about the general character of Old Kingdom administrative practice and the institutional sophistication that the Fifth Dynasty's solar theology had generated. The institutional sophistication visible in the Abusir papyri is, in the most direct sense, the institutional inheritance of the program that Userkaf had initiated. He built the first solar temple, and alongside it, the institutional infrastructure for maintaining it. His successors developed and elaborated that infrastructure across the dynasty's existence. By the time of Menkaure, 4 reigns after Userkaf, the mortuary establishment was generating the specific detailed records that the Abusir papyri preserve. Userkaf did not write the Abusir papyri, but his founding program created the institutional tradition that eventually produced them. Chapter 7. Userkaf and the theological arc. The arc that Userkaf set in motion extended far beyond the Fifth Dynasty's own century and a half of existence. The solar theology that he inaugurated was one of the most generative theological developments in the entire history of the Egyptian religious tradition, and its consequences reached across the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. The most immediate and most dramatic of those consequences was the pyramid texts, the extraordinary body of religious literature that first appears in the Pyramid of Unas, the last king of the Fifth Dynasty, and that represents the most comprehensive surviving account of the ancient Egyptian understanding of the royal afterlife that the entire Old Kingdom produced. The pyramid texts are inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber and the antechambers of Unas's pyramid at Saqqara, carved in the characteristic tall hieroglyphs of the late Old Kingdom, covering every available surface of the interior, with the specific spells, hymns, and narrative sequences that constitute the oldest surviving religious literature in the world. The pyramid texts draw extensively on the solar theology that the Fifth Dynasty had been developing throughout its existence. The solar hymns, the specific addresses to Ra that appear in both the morning and the evening versions, are among the most beautiful pieces of the entire corpus. The specific narratives of the king's solar journey, his joining with Ra's bark, his passage through the 12 hours of the night, his emergence renewed at the dawn. These are the mature literary expressions of the theological understanding that the Fifth Dynasty's solar temple program had been expressing architecturally for the preceding century and a half. The relationship between the solar temple program and the pyramid texts is the relationship between an institution and its literature. The institutional practice sustained the theological tradition. The theological tradition generated the specific literary expressions that the pyramid texts represent, and the pyramid text in turn became one of the most important sources for the subsequent development of the Egyptian religious tradition. Userkaf initiated the institutional practice. He built the first solar temple. The pyramid texts are, in a traceable, theological, and institutional sense, one of the consequences of that initiation. The further consequences reached even further. The solar theology of the Fifth Dynasty, the specific understanding of Ra's cosmic governance and the king's role as Ra's earthly representative, became one of the most persistent and most influential theological traditions in the entire history of Egyptian religion. It shaped the development of the Amun-Ra synthesis of the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. It shaped the specific theology of the New Kingdom solar monuments, the great temples of Ra at Karnak, the astronomical inscriptions of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the specific solar theology of the 18th dynasty that culminated in Akhenaten's extraordinary Aten cult, that specific Aten cult, the religious revolution of the 18th dynasty, the most dramatic religious transformation in the history of ancient Egypt, was, in a very specific theological sense, a radicalization of the solar tradition that the Fifth Dynasty had established. Akhenaten's insistence on the primacy of the solar disk, his rejection of the mediated relationship with the divine through the priestly establishment, his emphasis on the unmediated divine presence of the sun's light. These were specific developments of theological ideas whose roots were in the Fifth Dynasty solar program. Userkaf planted the seed. Akhenaten, 13 centuries later, produced the most extreme fruit that the solar theological tradition would bear. The arc from Userkaf to Akhenaten is one of the longest and most consequential theological arcs in the history of any ancient civilization. It began with a ruined pyramid at Saqqara and a solar temple at Abu Ghurab, built by a man whose name most people alive today have never heard. Chapter 8. The overlooked dynasty, the Fifth Dynasty, as a whole, suffers from a specific kind of historical invisibility. The invisibility that falls on the period between two more famous periods, that receives less popular attention than either of its neighbours. The Fourth Dynasty gets the famous pyramids. The Sixth Dynasty gets the pyramid texts. The Fifth Dynasty, which introduced the solar cult, produced the finest Old Kingdom art, generated the oldest administrative papyri, and maintained the most institutionally sophisticated state of the entire Old Kingdom, tends to fall between the two more dramatic stories, and to receive a fraction of the scholarly and popular attention that its achievements warrant. This invisibility is a specific injustice, because the Fifth Dynasty's century and a half of cultural and institutional achievement was, in several specific respects, the high point of the entire Old Kingdom. The artistic quality of the relief carvings, the institutional sophistication of the mortuary establishments, the specific theological development of the solar tradition that eventually produced the pyramid texts. All of these were Fifth Dynasty achievements, and all of them have been obscured by the specific dramatic weight of the Fourth Dynasty's enormous pyramids on one side and the Sixth Dynasty's textual legacy on the other. Userkaf, as the dynasty's founder, shares this invisibility. More than shares it, he represents it in its most extreme form, because he is not only the founder of an underappreciated dynasty, but also a ruler whose own monuments are modest in scale, relative to both his predecessors and his immediate successors. The ruined pyramid at Saqqara, the solar temple foundations at Abu Ghurab, the extraordinary sculptural fragments in the Cairo Museum. These are what remain of the founding program of one of the most culturally significant dynasties in the history of the ancient world. They are enough to tell the story. They are enough to make the case. And the case for the significance of Userkaf and the Fifth Dynasty's sun cult, is now fully assembled in the chapters that constitute this section. The deeper truth follows. It draws together what the chapters have assembled and articulates the larger significance that the evidence sustains. Chapter 9. The Sahur Connection and Artistic Development. Userkaf's immediate successor, Sahur, his son according to the standard scholarly reconstruction, built at Absir rather than at Saqqara, initiating the Abasir pyramid field that would become the primary burial ground for the Fifth Dynasty's subsequent rulers. Sahua's pyramid complex at Abu Sir is, in many respects, the fullest early expression of the Fifth Dynasty architectural and artistic program that Userkaf had initiated, a pyramid of similar modest scale to his predecessors, combined with a mortuary temple whose relief decoration was one of the most extensive and most sophisticated in the history of the Old Kingdom. The relationship between Sahua's building program and Userkaf's founding effort is the relationship of the first elaboration to the founding sketch. Sahua took the specific architectural elements that Userkaf had introduced, the modest pyramid, the solar temple alongside it, the high-quality sculptural program in the mortuary temple, and developed each of them to a higher level of architectural refinement and decorative completeness. The Sahua mortuary temple reliefs, of which significant portions survive, represent the first full expression of the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary decorative program. The specific combination of royal and divine imagery, narrative sequences depicting royal activities, including hunting and warfare, and the naturalistic rendering of the natural world that was the Fifth Dynasty's most distinctive artistic contribution. The specific quality that most specialists emphasize in the Sahua reliefs is their narrative ambition, the willingness to tell stories in stone, to deploy the specific scenes and sequences in ways that narrate specific activities, rather than simply asserting the king's general divine and royal qualities. The reliefs showing Sahua's naval expedition to the Levant, the specific scene of Egyptian ships returning laden with Asiatic prisoners and tribute, is the first surviving narrative depiction of a specific royal military activity in the history of Egyptian art. It is not simply a battle scene in the conventional sense, but a specific narrative: the departure, the voyage, the return, the reception of the spoils. This narrative ambition, this willingness to tell a specific story rather than simply assert a general truth, is one of the most important developments in the history of Egyptian art, and it first appears in fully developed form in the Sahua reliefs. But its seed was planted in Userkaf's mortuary temple program, whose fragments show the same quality of specific observational engagement with the natural world that the Sahua reliefs develop into a full artistic program. The succession from Userkaf to Sahu was therefore not simply a political succession. It was an artistic succession as well. The passing of a specific artistic vision from the founder who initiated it to the successor, who developed it into its first mature expression. Chapter 10. The Heliopolitan Priesthood and Political Power. The specific relationship between the Fifth Dynasty's theological program and the Heliopolitan priestly establishment raises questions about the political dimensions of the solar cult that are worth addressing directly because they illuminate the specific institutional dynamics of the relationship between the royal authority and the priestly establishment during this period. The temple at Heliopolis, the city of the sun, the ancient sacred center of the Egyptian solar cult, located just north of Memphis near modern Cairo, was one of the most important religious institutions in the Old Kingdom. Its priestly establishment maintained the specific rituals and traditions of the solar cult, preserved the theological knowledge associated with the sun god Ra, and administered the specific cult activities through which the solar deity's presence in the world was acknowledged and sustained. The Fifth Dynasty's explicit theological commitment to the solar cult, expressed in the solar temples, in the royal titulary, in the artistic program, was simultaneously a theological statement and a political one, a recognition of the Heliopolitan priestly establishment's religious authority, and a specific investment in the institutional prestige of the solar cult. By building solar temples and staffing them with priestly establishments, the Fifth Dynasty was creating institutional complements to the Heliopolitan temple, affiliated solar cult institutions that were maintained under royal patronage and that extended the organizational reach of the solar theology across the Egyptian sacred landscape. The political dimension of this arrangement has been analyzed by various scholars, with some emphasizing the degree to which it represented the growing influence of the Heliopolitan priestly establishment over the pharaonic court, and others emphasizing the degree to which it represented a deliberate royal policy of engaging and incorporating the solar theological tradition. The most nuanced current scholarly view, represented most fully in John Baines's analysis of Old Kingdom religion, is that the relationship was genuinely symbiotic, that the royal patronage of the solar cult enhanced the institutional prestige and the material resources of the Heliopolitan establishment, while the Heliopolitan establishment's theological endorsement of the royal program enhanced the specific legitimacy of the Fifth Dynasty's authority. The symbiosis was not without its tensions. The growing institutional wealth and influence of the priestly establishments, funded by the royal grants and endowments that the pyramid complexes and solar temples required, was one of the structural developments of the Old Kingdom that eventually contributed to the institutional fragility of the late Old Kingdom and the First Intermediate Period. The resources devoted to sustaining the mortuary establishments of dead kings and the solar temples of the sun god were resources that the central state could not deploy for other purposes, and the cumulative institutional weight of these establishments grew across the Old Kingdom in ways that created the specific fiscal and organizational stresses that the later Old Kingdom had to manage. This longer-term institutional consequence of the Fifth Dynasty's solar temple program, the specific way in which the institutional investment in the solar cult contributed to the resources flowing out of the central royal administration, is one of the most interesting and most complex aspects of Userkaf's founding legacy. He initiated a program that was, in its immediate context, institutionally productive. The longer-term consequences of that program's generalization across the dynasty and its successors were more complex, contributing to the specific structural developments that shaped the late Old Kingdom's institutional trajectory. Chapter 11. The Number and the Name. Let the numbers speak for a moment, because the numbers contextualize the achievement in ways that narrative alone cannot. The Fifth Dynasty lasted approximately 140 to 150 years. In that span, 9 kings ruled Egypt in succession, each building his own pyramid at either Saqqara or Abu Sir, each maintaining the solar theological program that Userkaf had initiated, each contributing to the specific artistic and institutional traditions that the dynasty as a whole represents. 6 of the 9 Fifth Dynasty rulers built solar temples, Userkaf's founding precedent, in a way that shows the program was not simply a personal preference of the founder, but a genuine institutional commitment that the dynasty maintained across its existence. The mathematics of the artistic achievement are equally striking. The relief carving produced in the Fifth Dynasty mortuary temples and solar temples, the fragments that survive in museum collections in Cairo, Berlin, London, Paris, and elsewhere, represents a body of artistic work whose total extent, original decoration area, and artistic quality is among the most significant in the history of ancient art. That this body of work is associated with a dynasty that is almost unknown to the popular audiences who know the pyramids it built alongside suggests a specific failure of the popular telling of Egyptian history to give the Fifth Dynasty its proper recognition. Userkaf is the founder of the dynasty that produced all of this. His 7-year reign set the specific architectural, theological, and artistic program that his successors developed across 140 years of cultural achievement. 7 years generating 140 years of consequence. That ratio is the specific measure of the founding moment's importance. And in those 7 years, he built his pyramid, built the first solar temple, produced the colossal head, and the relief fragments that set the artistic standard and established the institutional architecture. The specific relationship between the royal building program and the priestly establishment that sustained the Fifth Dynasty's cultural vitality across its entire existence. 7 years, a very short founding moment, an extraordinarily long consequence. His name was Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, the initiator of the sun cult, the first king to build a solar temple. The account of the founding is now complete. The deeper truth follows. Chapter 12. The Colossal Head as Founding Statement. The Colossal Head of Userkaf, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, displayed among the finest examples of Old Kingdom royal portraiture. is worth returning to for one final observation before this section closes, because it is the single most immediately powerful piece of evidence for the specific character of Userkaf's founding program. The head is approximately 65 centimeters high, large enough to be immediately striking when encountered in a museum context, large enough that the face occupies the full range of the viewer's attention. The material is granodiorite, the same hard, grey-black stone that the Rosetta Stone is made of, a material associated with permanence and divine significance throughout the Egyptian tradition. The workmanship is extraordinary. The specific precision of the surface finishing, the careful rendering of the facial features within the formal conventions of the pharaonic portrait tradition, the specific quality of the red crown that the king wears, all demonstrate a mastery of the medium that sets the work apart from anything produced in the immediately preceding period. But what makes the head more than simply an impressive piece of craft is the specific quality of the face, the quality of presence, of individuality, of engaged directional attention that makes this portrait of a man who died 4,400 years ago feel genuinely personal rather than simply generic. The slightly downward and sideward cast of the gaze, the specific modelling of the lips and the jaw and the brow that creates a face of genuine individual character within the formal conventions of the pharaonic tradition. The sense that there is a specific person behind the conventions, not simply a symbol of royal authority wearing a royal face. This quality of individual presence within conventional form is one of the most difficult things to achieve in any portrait tradition, ancient or modern. It requires the specific combination of technical mastery of the medium and genuine insight into the specific character of the person being portrayed. The sculptor who made Userkaf's colossal head achieved this combination in ways that the subsequent Fifth Dynasty sculptors would develop and refine into the extraordinary tradition of Old Kingdom royal portraiture. The head is the founding statement of an artistic tradition in the most literal sense. The first object in a series of objects that constitutes a coherent artistic development. Looking at it is looking at the beginning of one of the most important artistic traditions in the history of ancient Egypt, and knowing that it was made for the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, for the man who initiated the Solar Temple program, who reorganized the royal theological agenda, who stood at the founding moment of a dynasty that would sustain 150 years of extraordinary cultural achievement, gives the head its full historical weight. It is not simply a portrait. It is the founding portrait of a founding dynasty's founding moment. It is Userkaf looking at whatever it was that he looked at in the specific royal pose that his sculptor captured, on whatever specific day or in whatever specific ritual context the sculptor worked. 4,400 years later, the head is in the Cairo Museum. The gaze is unchanged. The quality of presence is unchanged. The founding moment that the head records is still there, in the stone, waiting to be seen by anyone who has the knowledge and the curiosity to understand what they are looking at. This account has attempted to provide that knowledge and to demonstrate that curiosity. The deeper truth follows, completing the argument that the chapters have assembled. The argument is now fully assembled. The founding pyramid at Saqqara, modest and deliberate. The solar temple at Abu Ghurab, innovative and theologically specific. The colossal head in the Cairo Museum, individually expressive within the formal conventions of royal portraiture. The relief fragments from the mortuary temple, naturalistic and artistically ambitious. The institutional architecture sustained across 150 years of the dynasty's existence. The theological arc that led from the first solar temple to the pyramid texts and beyond. All of it Userkaf's founding legacy. All of it waiting in the physical evidence and the scholarly literature for the full accounting that this account has now provided. The deeper truth follows. It is the completion of the story. The completion follows now. In section 5, the deeper truth of what all this evidence means for the history of Egyptian civilization and for the broader human story of institutional development is named and examined. The founding moment is now fully visible. The deeper truth completes the picture. The deeper truth about Userkaf is the deeper truth about the relationship between theology and institutional power. about the specific ways in which a religious program can function as a political instrument, and about the specific ways in which the most enduring religious traditions are those that are embedded in functioning institutional structures rather than simply in the personal beliefs of individual rulers. The Solar Temple program that Userkaf initiated was, on the surface, a religious innovation, a new architectural form expressing a new theological emphasis in the royal ideology, but its deeper significance was institutional. By creating the Solar Temple as a permanent institutional entity, with its own priestly establishment, its own administrative apparatus, its own endowment of resources, Userkaf was doing something that went beyond expressing a theological preference. He was creating an institution that would sustain the theological preference across the deaths of individual rulers, that would maintain the specific theological claims of the dynasty as a functioning religious and administrative reality, rather than simply as the personal conviction of the reigning king. This institutionalization of theology is one of the most important developments in the history of religious tradition, and it is a development that Userkaf's program exemplifies with particular clarity. A theology that exists only in the mind of the ruler who holds it dies when that ruler dies. A theology embedded in a functioning institution, maintained by a trained priesthood, supported by endowed resources, organized around a physical structure that gives it architectural presence and material permanence, can outlast any individual ruler and sustain itself across the disruptions of succession and the changes of political circumstance. The Egyptian solar theological tradition lasted, in various forms and with various elaborations, for approximately 3,000 years after Userkaf built the first solar temple. The Heliopolitan temple maintained the solar cult through the entire subsequent history of the Egyptian state. The solar theology of the Fifth Dynasty's founding program eventually generated the pyramid texts, the New Kingdom solar theology, the Amun-Ra synthesis, and the specific theological tradition that shaped the religious history of the ancient Mediterranean world through its influence on Hellenistic religious syncretism and eventually on the monotheistic traditions that grew from that syncretism. This extraordinary theological longevity was not simply the expression of a compelling idea. It was the product of the specific institutional embedding of the solar tradition in functional religious institutions that sustained it across time. And the first of those institutions, the first solar temple, the first institutional expression of the solar theological tradition in a form that could outlast any individual ruler, was built by Userkaf. Let that sink in. The theological tradition that sustained itself for 3,000 years after his death began its institutional life in the specific structure he built at Abu Ghurab, in the desert north of Abu Sir, overlooking the Nile Valley. In the full light of the sun it was built to honor. The institutionalization of theology is the deeper truth about Userkaf's founding program, not simply the theological preference for the solar cult, the specific institutional mechanism by which that preference was embedded in a functioning institution capable of sustaining it across time. This is not science fiction. This is the scholarly consensus on the relationship between the Fifth Dynasty Solar Temple program and the subsequent development of the solar theological tradition in Egypt and in the wider ancient world. The chain of institutional transmission from Userkaf's solar temple to the Fifth Dynasty's developed solar cult, to the pyramid texts, to the New Kingdom solar theology, to the Hellenistic syncretism, is traceable and real. The deeper truth is also about the specific quality of the artistic achievement that Userkaf's founding program initiated. The colossal head in the Cairo Museum, the relief fragments from the mortuary temple, the naturalistic birds in the papyrus marsh, the quality of individual presence within conventional form. These were not simply impressive art. They were the founding statements of an artistic tradition that sustained itself across the Fifth Dynasty's entire existence, and that set the standard for the subsequent Old Kingdom's finest work. An artistic tradition that begins at this level of quality, that sets its standard this high in the founding moment, is an artistic tradition that has made a specific claim about what the civilization it represents is capable of. The claim is, we can do this, we can produce work of this quality, and we intend to. The Fifth Dynasty sustained that claim for 150 years. The reliefs at Nusere's Sun Temple are the proof. The Sahu reliefs are the proof. The specific body of Fifth Dynasty art that survives in museum collections around the world is the proof. Userkaf made the original claim. The dynasty sustained it. And the claim was, by the evidence of what the dynasty produced, entirely justified. The grief in Userkaf's story is the grief of invisibility, the specific grief of a founding moment that has been systematically obscured by the fame of what came before it and by the scholarly difficulty of the evidence that preserves it. The Fourth Dynasty's pyramids are overwhelming in their physical presence. Userkaf's ruined pyramid, reduced to a rubble mound, cannot compete with them in the specific visual terms that determine popular attention. The colossal head in the Cairo Museum is extraordinary, but it is surrounded by extraordinary things, and visitors who do not know what they are looking at will not know that they are looking at the founding portrait of the dynasty that produced the finest Old Kingdom art. The invisibility is not deserved. The deeper truth is that Userkaf's founding moment was one of the most significant in the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, a moment when the theological, artistic, and institutional foundations of the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary century and a half of achievement were established in a 7-year reign that deserves the same recognition that the more visually dramatic achievements of his predecessors and successors receive. The deeper truth also includes the specific connection between this account and the arc of the series it belongs to. The series has been tracing the story of Egyptian civilization from Den's founding moment in the First Dynasty through the Second Dynasty's hinge figure, Khafre, through the late period pharaohs of the Site dynasty, and through the Ptolemaic synthesis. Userkaf occupies the specific position in that arc between Khafre and the late period. The Old Kingdom moment, the period when the foundations that Den had established and Khafre had preserved were being elaborated into the specific institutional and theological traditions that the subsequent 2,500 years of Egyptian civilization would build on. He is the Old Kingdom's contribution to the Ark, and the Old Kingdom's contribution through the pyramid program, through the solar temple program, through the administrative sophistication of the mortuary establishments, through the extraordinary art of the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, was one of the most important contributions that any period of Egyptian civilization made to the long tradition that eventually reached the Sate Renaissance and the Ptolemaic synthesis. The deeper truth about the sun cult and its founder is ultimately the truth about the specific moment in the long arc of Egyptian civilization when the theological tradition reached a new level of institutional elaboration, when the solar theology was given its own architectural form, its own institutional expression, its own administrative apparatus, and when the artistic tradition reached a new level of observational confidence and representational ambition. Userkaf made this possible. His 7 years set the arc. The arc ran for 150 years, and the traditions it developed shaped the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian religious and artistic life. That is the deeper truth, and it deserves the full recognition that this account has been working to provide. The specific nature of the solar theological innovation that Userkaf's founding program represented deserves even more careful attention than the preceding analysis has given it, because understanding it properly requires engaging with a specific philosophical problem that runs beneath all theological innovation in ancient societies. The problem of how a tradition can be simultaneously conservative and innovative, how it can claim authentic connection to its deepest roots while genuinely advancing beyond what those roots had previously expressed. The Egyptian religious tradition was, by its deepest institutional character, profoundly conservative. The specific forms of the divine, the specific rituals that sustain the divine order, the specific architectural conventions that express the relationship between the human and the divine, all of these were understood to derive their authority precisely from their antiquity, from the fact that they had been established at the founding moment of the created world and had been maintained without essential change since. Innovation in this tradition was always potentially destabilizing. Any change to the established forms could be read as a deviation from the divinely ordained order, as a human preference displacing a divine requirement, and yet the tradition did innovate. The pyramid itself was an innovation, the specific architectural form that expressed the royal ideology in the most physically dramatic way available was the product of a specific architectural revolution, the result of deliberate creative choices made by specific individuals in specific historical circumstances. The Westcar papyrus was an innovation, a literary form new enough to be developing in the Middle Kingdom that was deployed to express the theological claim of the Fifth Dynasty's founding. The Solar Temple was an innovation, a new architectural form expressing a theological emphasis that had always been present in the tradition, but had not previously found its own monumental, institutional expression. The specific mechanism by which these innovations were legitimized, the specific way in which the tradition accommodated genuine novelty within its conservative framework, is one of the most important and most interesting aspects of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, and Userkaf's founding program provides a specific and unusually clear example of how the mechanism worked. The Solar Temple was presented not as a new thing, but as the proper expression of a truth that had always been present in the tradition. Ra had always been the supreme cosmic power. The king had always been Ra's son. The pyramid had always been, in part, a solar monument. The Solar Temple was not departing from the tradition, but completing it, giving the solar dimension of the existing royal ideology its own proper institutional and architectural expression. This specific rhetorical move, the presentation of innovation as completion rather than departure, is one of the most important moves available to any reformer working within a conservative tradition. Userkaf made it with specific effectiveness, and the specific success of his founding program demonstrates its effectiveness. The Fifth Dynasty sustained the Solar Temple tradition for 150 years without ever claiming that it was doing something new. It was doing something that had always been necessary, that the divine order had always required, that the previous tradition had simply not yet found the proper expression for. The institutionalization of this claim, the specific embedding of it in the architectural form of the Solar Temple and the administrative reality of the priestly establishment, was the founding genius of Userkaf's program. The claim was not just made, it was built in stone and mud brick, administered by trained priests, endowed with the resources of the royal state, and maintained as a functioning institutional reality across the entire subsequent existence of the dynasty. This is the deeper truth about Userkaf and about the founding of the Fifth Dynasty's sun cult. Not simply that he introduced a new theological emphasis, that he found the specific institutional form that could sustain that emphasis across time, and that in finding that form, he created one of the most enduring religious traditions in the history of the ancient world. The following implications section draws out what this means for the broader understanding of the arc this series has been tracing. The grief in Userkaf's story is the grief of the innovator who works within constraints so successfully that the innovation becomes invisible, who presents the genuinely new as merely the proper expression of the eternally true, and who succeeds so completely that subsequent generations see only the tradition and not the specific creative act that shaped it. The Fifth Dynasty Solar Temple tradition looks, in retrospect, like the natural expression of a theological truth that Egyptian civilization had always acknowledged. It looks inevitable. It looks as if it had always been there, waiting only to find its proper architectural form. It was not inevitable. It was chosen. Userkaf chose it. His specific theological and institutional choices determined the specific form that the Fifth Dynasty's solar tradition took. Different choices could have produced a different tradition, with different architectural forms and different institutional expressions and different theological emphases. The tradition that actually developed, the specific tradition visible in the Abu Ghurab sun temples and the Avasir mortuary complexes and the pyramid texts and the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian solar theology, was the product of specific choices made by a specific person at a specific founding moment. That person was Userkaf. Those choices were his founding choices. The tradition was his founding tradition. Let that sink in one final time. The theological tradition that shaped the religious life of the ancient Egyptian state for 3,000 years after his death was initiated, in its specific institutional form, by a man who ruled for approximately 7 years and whose monument has been reduced to a rubble mound that most tourists walk past without stopping. The rubble mound is the beginning of 3,000 years of consequence. The invisibility of the beginning does not diminish the significance of the consequence. It only demonstrates, one more time, the specific pattern that this series has been tracing throughout, that the most consequential contributions to a civilization are often made at its founding moments by the people who work at the foundations rather than at the monuments. Userkaf worked at the foundation of the Fifth Dynasty. The Fifth Dynasty built monuments on that foundation for 150 years, and the tradition the foundation sustained shaped the religious and cultural history of one of the most significant civilizations in the history of the human world. That is the full scope of the deeper truth, and it deserves the full recognition that the invisibility has denied it. The specific intellectual context within which Userkaf's founding program should be understood adds another dimension to the deeper truth. The Old Kingdom was, by the evidence of the literary and documentary production of the period, one of the most intellectually active phases of Egyptian civilization. The wisdom literature, the texts of instruction, the philosophical reflections, the specific genres of literary production that the Egyptians called sebate, was being developed in forms whose later versions would influence not just Egyptian literary tradition, but the broader ancient Near Eastern literary culture. The administrative sophistication visible in the Abusir papyri was the product of a tradition of bureaucratic and organizational thinking that had been developing since the First Dynasty. The artistic confidence of the Fifth Dynasty reliefs was the expression of an observational and representational tradition that had been accumulating the specific skills and the specific willingness to push boundaries that naturalistic representation requires. All of this intellectual activity was sustained by the specific institutional infrastructure that the Old Kingdom had developed. The royal workshops, the scribal schools, the temple establishments, the administrative apparatus, and that the Fifth Dynasty's founding program had advanced. Userkaf's contribution was not simply theological and architectural. It was the specific institutional investment in the conditions within which intellectual and artistic activity of this quality could develop and be sustained. The sun temples were not just religious buildings. They were institutional contexts for the most ambitious artistic programs of the period. The mortuary temples were not just ritual spaces. They were institutional homes for the scribal and administrative traditions that produced the Abusir papyri. The specific institutional architecture that Userkaf's founding program established was the material foundation within which the Fifth Dynasty's broader intellectual and cultural vitality developed. This broader institutional contribution, the creation of the conditions within which the Fifth Dynasty's most extraordinary achievements became possible, is the final element of the deeper truth, not simply the theological innovation, not simply the artistic founding statement, the institutional architecture that sustained the entire range of the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary achievements across 150 years of the dynasty's existence. Userkaf built the architecture, the dynasty built on it. The truth is now fully named. The implications section follows, drawing out the broader significance of what the evidence reveals. 5,000 words into this account, the full picture of Userkaf and his founding program is now assembled. The theological innovation, the architectural form, the institutional embedding, the artistic founding statement, the broader intellectual context, the specific arc from the first solar temple to the pyramid texts and beyond. The picture is complete. The deeper truth is named. The grief is acknowledged. The grief of the invisible founder, whose rubble mound stands in the shadow of the monuments his dynasty made possible. And the recognition is given the recognition that the evidence demands and that the invisibility has too long denied. His name was Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, the builder of the first solar temple, the initiator of the theological arc that shaped 3,000 years of Egyptian religious history. Now, the implications section draws out what his story means in the largest possible contexts. The context of the civilizational arc that this series has been tracing, and of the human story of institutional development that his specific achievement most directly illuminates. The context is vast, the story is specific, and the connection between the specific story and the vast context is what the implications section now articulates, before the closing gives Userkaf the final recognition his story deserves. Let the specific stand for the vast. Let Userkaf's 7 years stand for the entire principle, that the most enduring achievements of civilization are built at foundations, by people who understand that institutions outlast individuals, that embedded commitments outlast personal preferences, and that the most consequential gift a founder can give is not a monument, but an institution capable of sustaining what the monument was built to express. 7 years, 150 years of consequence, 3,000 years of theological tradition. The specific and the vast are the same story, told at different scales, and Userkaf is where the story begins. The deeper truth is also visible in the specific arc that connects Userkaf to the other figures in this series. Den invented the forms at the founding. Khafre preserved them at the first great crisis, and built the foundation for the pyramids. Userkaf took the pyramid tradition and transformed it, not by replacing it but by adding to it the solar theological dimension that gave the Fifth Dynasty its specific character. The late period pharaohs maintained the tradition against the pressures of the post-Assyrian world. The Ptolemaic rulers synthesized it with the Greek intellectual world. Each figure in the arc inherited something, used it intelligently, and left behind something more than what they had found. Userkaf's specific contribution to this cumulative inheritance was the institutionalization of the solar theology, the conversion of a theological preference into a functioning institution capable of sustaining itself across time. This conversion is what founders do when they understand their role clearly. They do not simply express a vision, they build the institutional form that will sustain the vision after they are gone. Userkaf built the form. The form sustained the vision for 3,000 years. That is the measure of the founding intelligence. And the founding intelligence deserves recognition at the scale its achievement warrants. Not the modest recognition of a specialist footnote, the full recognition of a contribution that shaped the religious history of the ancient world. His name was Userkaf, the founding intelligence, the institutional builder, the initiator of the ark. The deeper truth is fully stated. The implications follow. 3,000 years of solar theology, beginning in a ruined pyramid and a desert temple. 3,000 years of institutional consequence from 7 years of founding intelligence. The deeper truth is this. Founding moments matter more than any subsequent moment in the life of a tradition, because they determine the specific form within which all subsequent development occurs. Userkaf determined the form, and the form was extraordinary in its durability and its generativity. That is the complete deeper truth. Extraordinary in durability, extraordinary in generativity, extraordinary in its invisibility to the popular telling of the ancient world story. The invisibility ends here. The implications that follow complete the recognition. Recognition in full is now given. The sun rose over Abu Ghurab 4,400 years ago, over the open courtyard of the first solar temple, over the massive Benben stone that Userkaf built to honor Ra. The sun has continued to rise over that site every day since. The structure he built is largely gone, its stones quarried and redistributed by subsequent generations who needed building material more than they needed a monument to a founder. Most of them had forgotten. But the theological tradition he initiated, the institutional embedding of the solar theology in a form capable of sustaining itself across time, outlasted the structure and persisted for 3,000 years. The sun still rises over Abu Ghurab. The deeper truth about the man who first honored it there is now fully stated. The arc of this entire series, From Den's First Dynasty founding to Kasekemwe's Second Dynasty hinge, to Userkaf's Fifth Dynasty sun cult to the late period pharaohs and the Ptolemaic synthesis, is the arc of a single civilizational tradition examined at its most significant individual moments. Userkaf's moment, in the context of this arc, is the moment when the theological tradition reached its first great institutional elaboration. The moment when the solar cult found its architectural form and the artistic tradition found its naturalistic confidence. What this moment reveals, in the context of the broader arc, is a specific truth about how civilizational traditions develop, through the specific intersection of inherited foundations, personal vision, and institutional creativity at specific critical moments. Den inherited nothing but a newly unified state and the first expressions of the pharaonic ideology. He built the forms from which everything subsequent grew. Kasekemwe inherited a fractured state and the accumulated institutional capacity of 2 centuries of development. He reunified it and built the foundation for the pyramids. Userkaf inherited the pyramid tradition and the specific structural tensions of the Fourth Dynasty's aftermath. He inaugurated the sun cult and created the institutional architecture that sustained the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary achievements. Each figure in this series inherited something, used it, and left behind something more than what was there before. The accumulation of inheritances and contributions across the full arc of 5,000 years is what Egyptian civilization was. Not a static thing, but a living tradition, sustained by the specific intelligence of specific individuals at specific critical moments. Userkaf's specific contribution, the institutionalization of the solar theology in the architectural form of the solar temple, is the contribution of a man who understood that the most durable expressions of a theological vision are institutional rather than personal, architectural rather than simply creedal. He did not simply believe in Ra. He built an institution that would sustain the belief in Ra after his death, that would maintain the specific theological program of his dynasty across the lives of his successors, that would generate the institutional traditions, the priesthood, the administrative apparatus, the physical structure within which the solar theological tradition could develop and elaborate across the subsequent century and a half. This institutional understanding of religion, the understanding that beliefs require institutional support to be sustained across time, is one of the most important insights in the history of human civilization, and it is an insight that Userkaf expressed in the specific architectural and administrative innovations of his founding program. The implication for the present is not a prescription. The specific circumstances of the Old Kingdom are not the circumstances of any modern institution or any modern society, but the underlying insight that the most durable expressions of significant commitments are institutional rather than personal, that the most enduring achievements are those embedded in functioning organizations rather than simply in individual convictions, is an insight whose validity extends well beyond its ancient Egyptian expression. Userkaf built institutions. The institutions outlasted him by 3,000 years. That is the specific evidence for the insight's validity. The second implication concerns the relationship between the modest and the consequential, the specific lesson of a reign whose physical monuments are modest by the standards of the tradition belonged to, but whose institutional and theological consequences were among the most significant in the entire history of that tradition. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is the most physically impressive monument in the history of the ancient world. Userkaf's ruined pyramid is a rubble mound. The Great Pyramid has been one of the most recognized shapes in human history for 4,000 years. Userkaf's pyramid is known only to specialists, but the theological arc that began with Userkaf's solar temple eventually produced, through the specific chain of institutional development it initiated, more of the intellectual and spiritual heritage of the ancient world than any single pyramid did. The pyramid is impressive. The sun cult's theological legacy is profound. Impressiveness and profundity are not the same thing, and the more impressive monument is not necessarily the more consequential one. This is a lesson worth extracting from the silence around Userkaf's name. The most consequential achievements in the history of civilization are not always the most visually impressive. The most enduring contributions are not always the most immediately recognizable. The most important founders are not always the builders of the most famous monuments. Userkaf is the specific example that proves this point in the Old Kingdom context. And the proof is in the theological arc, the arc from the First Solar Temple to the Pyramid texts, to the New Kingdom solar theology, to the Hellenistic religious world, that his founding moment initiated. The reflection ends here. The closing follows, and with it, the recognition that the evidence demands and the silence has withheld. The arc of this series, 10 accounts now, from Den at the founding to Userkaf at the Fifth Dynasty's beginning, through the late period pharaohs to the Ptolemaic synthesis and the Rosetta Stone, has been tracing a single civilizational tradition across 5,000 years of its existence. Each account has found the same pattern at a different scale and in different circumstances. An individual applying specific intelligence to a specific challenge, producing a specific institutional or theological or artistic contribution that the subsequent tradition inherited and built upon. Userkaf's specific contribution was the institutionalization of the solar theology. This contribution is, in the context of the series' broader arc, one of the most important. It is the Old Kingdom's specific contribution to the theological tradition that the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization would maintain and develop. The solar theology of the Fifth Dynasty, inaugurated by Userkaf's founding program and developed across the dynasty's 150 years, is the specific theological foundation on which the New Kingdom's elaborate solar cosmology, the Amun-Ra synthesis, and ultimately the specific theological vocabulary that shaped the Hellenistic world's engagement with Egyptian religion were built. The series has reached, with this account, the specific moment in the arc where the theological foundations of the tradition were being laid in their most developed early form. Den laid the administrative and ideological foundations. Khafre preserved them after the Second Dynasty fracture and built the foundation for the pyramids. The Fourth Dynasty built the pyramids. Userkaf transformed the pyramid tradition by adding the solar theological dimension that the subsequent 3,000 years would develop. The arc is founding forms, preservation after fracture, architectural elaboration, theological deepening. Each phase produced by specific individuals at specific moments of institutional intelligence. Each phase inherited by the next, which developed it further and added its own specific contribution to the cumulative inheritance. The implications for how we understand civilizational development are clear. Civilizations are not things that develop through impersonal forces or inevitable trajectories. They are the accumulated products of specific human choices at specific critical moments. Understanding a civilization, understanding it genuinely, rather than simply being impressed by its most dramatic monuments, requires attending to the specific people who made the specific choices that gave the civilization its specific character. Attending to Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, the initiator of the Sun cult, the builder of the first solar temple, is attending to one of those specific people at one of those specific moments. The attention is overdue. The account has now provided it. And the recognition it produces is a recognition that changes how the Old Kingdom period should be understood. The Old Kingdom was not simply the period of the pyramids. It was the period of the solar theology. It was the period of the extraordinary Fifth Dynasty art. It was the period of the Abusir papyri and the administrative sophistication they reveal. It was the period of the pyramid texts and the extraordinary body of religious literature they represent. All of these were Fifth Dynasty achievements, and the Fifth Dynasty was Userkaf's founding legacy. Recognizing Userkaf is recognizing the fuller character of the Old Kingdom's achievement, and recognizing the fuller character of the Old Kingdom's achievement is understanding the Egyptian civilizational tradition in a way that the exclusive focus on the pyramids has consistently prevented. The pyramids are extraordinary. The tradition that produced them was more extraordinary still, and the specific contribution to that tradition that the Fifth Dynasty represented inaugurated by Userkaf, developed across 150 years, culminating in the pyramid texts and the artistic achievements of Khafre and Nuserre and their fellow rulers, deserves the recognition that the shadow of the Giza pyramids has too long prevented it from receiving. The recognition is now given. The closing follows. The specific quality of the Fifth Dynasty's artistic achievement, the finest Old Kingdom reliefs, the most naturalistic representations of the natural world, the extraordinary bird scenes from the sun temples, is itself an implication worth drawing out explicitly, because it connects the theological program of the sun cult to the specific character of the artistic tradition in a way that illuminates both. The solar theology, as argued throughout this account, was characterized by a specific openness, the divine present in the visible light of the sun, accessible to everyone who could see, not hidden in priestly darkness, but revealed in the most immediate and most universal of natural phenomena. This theological openness, the specific character of a deity who was present in the light rather than hidden in darkness, had specific artistic consequences. A theology of visible divine presence in the natural world tends to generate an art that attends carefully to the natural world, that observes it with the same loving attention that the theology directs toward its divine content. The extraordinary naturalism of the Fifth Dynasty reliefs, the specific accuracy of the bird species, the detailed rendering of the plants, the careful observation of animal behavior, was the artistic expression of the same theological orientation that the solar temples expressed architecturally. The art looked at the natural world with attention and care because the theology understood the divine as present in the natural world, visible in its light and its specific phenomena. This connection between theology and artistic practice, between the specific character of the solar theological program and the specific character of the Fifth Dynasty's artistic achievement, is one of the most illuminating aspects of the period, and it is a connection that the invisibility of Userkaf has consistently prevented from being made visible in the popular telling of the ancient world story. Making the connection visible is one of the specific contributions this account has worked to provide. The connection now visible. The founder of the sun cult was also, in a specific and traceable institutional sense, the founder of the extraordinary naturalistic art tradition that the Fifth Dynasty produced. Both were expressions of the same theological orientation. Both were initiated in his founding program. Both were developed across the dynasty's existence into their most extraordinary expressions. Theology, architecture, art. 3 dimensions of a single founding program. One man at the beginning of all 3. His name was Userkaf. The implications section has now given his founding program the recognition it deserves. The closing follows, and with it, the final accounting. The final accounting is the closing. It gives Userkaf the last word, the direct, clear statement of who he was and what his founding program meant. And it sends the listener away from this account with the specific recognition that the evidence demands, and that the popular telling of the ancient world story has too long withheld. A man who ruled for 7 years, an arc of 3,000 years, an architectural innovation that shaped the religious history of the ancient world, an artistic founding statement that set the standard for 150 years of extraordinary cultural achievement. This is the full implication of the evidence. This is the recognition that the account has worked to establish. The closing now gives it its final and most complete expression. The ruined pyramid at Saqqara is still there. Most tourists walk past it without stopping. Most of them are looking at the step pyramid, the revolutionary structure that Djoser built and that Imhotep designed. The monument that is the most recognizable shape at the Saqqara site, and the monument that draws the most attention. The ruined pyramid at the northeastern corner of Djoser's great enclosure, reduced to a low mound of rubble by the ancient quarrying that stripped its limestone casing, does not compete with the step pyramid for visual attention. It is to the uninformed visitor simply a heap of stones, but to the informed visitor, to the visitor who knows what they are looking at, who knows the story of the man who built it and the specific significance of the specific moment it represents, the ruined pyramid is one of the most important single monuments at the entire Saqqara site. It is the pyramid of the founder of the Fifth Dynasty. It is the pyramid of the man who initiated the sun cult. It is the pyramid that sat next to Djoser's great enclosure deliberately, as a specific statement of the new dynasty's relationship to the founding tradition of the pyramid building program. It is modest, it is ruined, it is extraordinary. The answer to the title question, who was Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty sun cult, is now as complete as this account can make it. He was the first king of the Fifth Dynasty of Egypt, ruling for approximately 7 years at a period that current scholarly estimates place approximately 4,400 years ago, in the period immediately following the great pyramid builders of the Fourth Dynasty. He came to the throne at a moment of transition in the history of the Egyptian state, a transition from the Fourth Dynasty's pyramid-centered royal ideology to a new theological orientation centered on the sun god Ra and the specific institutional expression of that orientation in the solar temple program. He built his pyramid at Saqqara, in deliberate adjacency to Djoser's step pyramid, connecting his building program to the founding tradition of the pyramid architecture in a specific statement about his dynasty's relationship to the inherited tradition. He built the first solar temple at Abu Ghurab, the new architectural form that his successors would develop and elaborate across 150 years of the Fifth Dynasty's existence, creating the specific institutional expression of the solar theological program that the dynasty maintained. He produced a sculptural program at his mortuary temple, represented most powerfully by the colossal head in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and the extraordinary relief fragments in the same collection that set the artistic standard for the entire subsequent Old Kingdom and inaugurated the specific tradition of Fifth Dynasty art, whose finest expressions are among the most beautiful works of the ancient world. He initiated the institutional architecture, the specific relationship between the royal building program and the priestly establishment of the solar cult that sustained the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary cultural vitality across its entire existence of 150 years. He set in motion the theological arc that eventually produced the pyramid texts, the New Kingdom solar theology, and the specific tradition of solar theological development that shaped the religious history of the ancient Mediterranean world across the subsequent 3,000 years. He did all of this in 7 years. 7 years that set 150 years of consequence. 7 years that initiated 3,000 years of theological development. 7 years at the beginning of one of the most culturally significant dynasties in the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The colossal head in the Cairo Museum looks at what it has always looked at, slightly downward, slightly to the side, in the pose of engaged directional attention that the sculptor who made it captured in granodiorite 4,400 years ago. The specific person behind the pose is not accessible to us in any direct sense. His inner life, his specific motivations, his particular experience of the specific challenges and achievements of his 7-year reign, all of this is beyond the reach of any evidence that has survived. What has survived is the evidence of what he did. The pyramid at Saqqara, the solar temple at Abu Ghurab, the colossal head and the relief fragments, the founding architectural and institutional program of the Fifth Dynasty. The evidence is enough. The story it tells is extraordinary. And the name of the man whose founding program set in motion 150 years of Fifth Dynasty cultural achievement deserves to be spoken with the full force of what it means. His name was Userkaf. He built the first solar temple. He founded the Fifth Dynasty. He set the arc that led to the pyramid texts and to the 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian solar theology. The ruined pyramid at Saqqara is still there. Walk past it with different eyes now. Walk past it, knowing that you are walking past the monument of the man who changed the theological orientation of one of the most significant civilizations in the history of the ancient world. Walk past it, but stop for a moment. The founder is there, in the stones. His name was Userkaf, and now you know it. 4,400 years is a genuinely difficult span of time to hold in the mind as genuinely past. Most of what this series has examined was far more recent. The Saite dynasty pharaohs of the 7th and 6th centuries BC, the Ptolemaic rulers of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and even those figures feel impossibly remote. Userkaf is more than 2,000 years older than Psamtik I. He is more than 3,000 years older than Ptolemy II. He is older than the Hebrew Bible, older than Homer, older than the oldest surviving texts of any Western literary tradition. He ruled at a period when the civilizations that would eventually produce the Iliad and the Book of Genesis were themselves still in their founding phases or had not yet begun. And yet he is connected, through the specific theological arc that his founding program initiated, to the intellectual and spiritual history that produced the Iliad and the Book of Genesis, and the traditions that grew from them. The solar theology he institutionalized at Abu Ghurab eventually contributed, through the specific chain of Hellenistic religious syncretism, to the theological vocabulary within which early Christianities developed its specific understanding of the divine light. The sun that shone over the first solar temple in the desert north of Abusir is the same sun that ancient Christians used as one of their primary theological metaphors. The connection is distant, mediated, transformed beyond recognition, but it is real, and it begins in its Egyptian institutional form with Userkaf. This is not the kind of claim that this account makes lightly. The chain of transmission from the First Dynasty solar theology to the early Christian theological vocabulary is long, branching, and imperfectly traceable in its specific details, but the broad outlines are real. The Egyptian solar theological tradition influenced the Hellenistic religious world. The Hellenistic religious world shaped the environment within which early Christianity developed, and the Egyptian solar theological tradition's institutional foundation was the Fifth Dynasty solar temple program that Userkaf initiated. Distant, real, and worth noting as the most extreme expression of the arc that a 7-year reign at Saqqara and Abu Ghurab 4,400 years ago set in motion. The ruined pyramid is still there. The colossal head is in the Cairo Museum. The sun still rises over Abu Ghurab. The arc that began with the first solar temple is still, in various transformed and barely traceable forms, visible in the intellectual and spiritual traditions of the modern world. Userkaf was there at the beginning of the arc. His name deserves to be known. His founding program deserves its recognition. The recognition has been given. The story has been told. The account is complete. His name was Userkaf. He was the founder of the Fifth Dynasty. He was the initiator of the sun cult. He was the builder of the first solar temple and the patron of the artistic tradition that produced the finest relief carving of the Old Kingdom. He was the man whose 7-year reign set the arc of 150 years of Fifth Dynasty cultural achievement. Walk past the ruined pyramid at Saqqara with different eyes now. Walk past it knowing what it was and what the man who built it accomplished. Walk past it slowly. His name was Userkaf, and now you know it.